Lady Eleanor Hartley stood at the edge of the ballroom, her gloved fingers smoothing the pale rose silk of her gown for the third time in as many minutes, and she told herself that the nervous flutter in her chest was merely anticipation rather than hope, though she knew herself well enough to recognize the lie. The crystal chandeliers of Almack's assembly rooms cast their golden light over the most exclusive gathering in all of London, illuminating silk gowns that cost more than many families earned in a year and jewels that caught the light like captured stars, while the orchestra played a Strauss waltz that made the very air seem to shimmer with possibility. Eleanor inhaled deeply, catching the mingled scents of beeswax candles, expensive French perfume, and something else she could not quite name, but recognized instinctively as the smell of ambition, of matrimonial hope, of young ladies and their mammas all waiting for that one perfect moment that would secure their futures. The 7 patronesses of Almack's sat in their gilt chairs along the wall like judges at an invisible court, their sharp eyes missing nothing, their approval or disapproval capable of making or destroying a reputation with a single glance. And Eleanor was acutely aware that they had opened the doors at precisely 11 o'clock, as they always did, turning away even dukes and princes who arrived so much as a minute late. For at Almack's the rules were absolute, and social standing meant nothing if one could not follow them. Her mother leaned close, the urgency in her whisper barely concealed beneath a veneer of maternal concern, and Eleanor felt the familiar weight of expectation settle across her shoulders like an invisible shawl. "There he is, darling," her mother breathed, her fan fluttering with barely suppressed excitement. "Stand straight, smile but not too broadly. Remember you are the daughter of an earl, and you must act as though you expect his attention rather than hoping for it." Eleanor resisted the urge to roll her eyes at this oft-repeated instruction, instead replying softly, "Mamma, please. He may not even approach," though even as she spoke the words she felt her heart betray her with its quickening rhythm. She had met James Rothwell, the Duke of Ashford, exactly 4 times at various social functions over the past 6 weeks, and each time he had seemed attentive in a way that made her think perhaps, just perhaps, he saw her as more than merely another eligible young lady in a sea of pale muslins and practiced smiles. He was 27 to her 23, possessed of a fortune that made even the wealthiest families in London look modest by comparison, and blessed with the kind of aristocratic good looks that made debutantes stumble over their carefully rehearsed conversations. Yet when he had spoken with Eleanor at Lady Pemberton's musicale, he had asked her opinion on the performance rather than simply complimenting her gown, and that small gesture of respect had lodged itself in her chest like a warm coal. Now, as she watched the couples swirl across the polished floor in their elegant patterns, she allowed herself the dangerous indulgence of imagining herself among them, her hand in his, her future suddenly bright with promise, instead of shadowed by the creeping fear that 23 was perilously close to being permanently on the shelf. The great doors of Almack's opened once more, and a subtle shift rippled through the assembly, the kind of collective awareness that occurs when someone of true consequence enters a room, and Eleanor found her gaze drawn inexorably toward the entrance, where James Rothwell, Duke of Ashford, stood surveying the ballroom with the calm assurance of a man who had never in his life questioned his welcome anywhere. He was tall, perhaps a full head taller than most men present, with dark hair that gleamed almost black in the candlelight, and eyes of such a striking green that Eleanor had once heard a young lady compare them to emeralds, though she privately thought they were more like the sea before a storm, changeable and deep and slightly dangerous. His evening attire was impeccable, all black, superfine wool and crisp white linen, cut to emphasize the breadth of his shoulders and the lean athleticism of a man who rode and fenced and did not spend all his days in idle luxury. And beside him, Lord Peter Bancroft looked almost diminished, despite being a handsome man in his own right, for the Duke possessed that indefinable quality that drew every eye without apparent effort. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat as his gaze swept the room with methodical purpose, passing over clusters of hopeful debutantes and their mammas, skimming past the patronesses with a polite nod of acknowledgement, and then landing directly on her with an intensity that made her feel suddenly exposed, as though he could see past the carefully arranged silk and practiced poise to the nervous young woman beneath. Around her the whispers began immediately, that peculiar phenomenon of drawing rooms and ballrooms where news travelled faster than sound should allow, and she heard the words spoken behind fans and gloved hands even as she tried to focus on maintaining her composure. "The Duke is approaching the Hartley girl," someone murmured with a note of surprise, and Eleanor felt her mother's fingers dig into her arm with barely suppressed triumph, the grip tight enough to leave marks that would bloom purple by morning. Her palms grew damp inside her evening gloves, and she prayed desperately that he would not notice when he took her hand, for there was nothing quite so mortifying as clammy palms during a first dance, and she could feel the weight of dozens of gazes upon her as he began walking in her direction with clear and unmistakable purpose. Other young ladies watched with expressions ranging from envy to frank curiosity, their careful social masks slipping just enough to reveal the disappointment or fascination beneath, while their mammas leaned toward each other behind rapidly fluttering fans, already calculating what this attention might mean for their own daughters' prospects. The orchestra was transitioning to a new piece, the notes hanging in the air like a question awaiting its answer. And the ballroom seemed to hush in that peculiar way that crowds do when they sense something significant is about to occur, as though all of London society was collectively holding its breath. Lord Bancroft's voice carried across the diminishing space between them, pitched just loud enough for nearby listeners to hear, his tone carrying a hint of amusement as he said, "Going to claim your dance, Ashford?" The Duke nodded in response, but his expression remained unreadable, formal in a way that Eleanor could not quite interpret, his mouth set in a line that was neither smile nor frown, but something carefully neutral, and as he drew closer she could see that his green eyes held an emotion she could not name, something that sent a small shiver of unease down her spine even as her heart continued its traitorous pounding. The room held its breath, and Eleanor held hers with it, standing as straight as her mother had instructed, her smile practiced but genuine, her entire future seeming to balance on whatever words would come next. The Duke of Ashford stopped directly before Eleanor and her mother, his polished boots coming to rest on the gleaming parquet floor, with a finality that seemed to echo through the sudden silence, and he executed a bow of such perfect formality that it should have been reassuring, but instead felt oddly cold, like the proper gesture performed without any warmth behind it. Eleanor began her curtsy in response, her body moving through the practiced motion with automatic grace, even as her heart soared with anticipation, already imagining the feel of his hand at her waist as they moved through the waltz, already composing in her mind the careful responses she would give to the inevitable questions about their dance that would follow, and she was halfway through the dip when his voice cut through her dreams like a blade through silk. "Lady Eleanor, Lady Hartley," he said, his tone as formal and impersonal as his bow had been, each word enunciated with aristocratic precision. "I must respectfully decline to dance this evening." The words hung in the air, and for a heartbeat Eleanor thought she had misheard, that surely he had said something else entirely. But then he continued, and each syllable fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of destruction outward in ever-widening circles. "I fear I have given the wrong impression of my intentions," he stated, as though he were discussing the weather or commenting on the quality of the refreshments rather than destroying a young woman's reputation before the most influential gathering in London. I have no wish to court Lady Eleanor, and I would not mislead her or this company further. My apologies." He bowed again with that same perfect formality, and then he simply walked away, his broad shoulders disappearing back into the crowd, as though nothing of consequence had occurred, as though he had not just shattered Eleanor's world into fragments too small to ever piece back together. Eleanor froze mid-curtsy, caught in that awkward half-bent position like a puppet whose strings had been suddenly cut. And she felt the blood drain from her face so rapidly that for a moment she thought she might actually faint. Though some stubborn core of pride kept her upright, even as the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Her mother gasped audibly beside her, a sound of shock and horror that would have been comical in any other context, and around them the whispers that had been merely curious moments before exploded into a roar of scandal that filled the ballroom like floodwater. Eleanor felt as though the floor had opened beneath her feet, and she was falling into some dark abyss where every eye in London watched her descent with fascination, and humiliation burned through her veins like fire, hot and consuming, and absolutely inescapable. Her hands began to tremble inside her gloves, and she clasped them together to still the shaking. But it was useless. Her entire body had begun to betray her with its physical manifestation of her internal devastation. The golden ballroom that had seemed so full of promise mere moments ago transformed into a nightmare of gilt and candlelight, every beautiful surface now reflecting back her disgrace, every gleaming chandelier illuminating her humiliation for all to see. Every eye in Almack's fixed upon her with the avid attention that society reserves for its most delicious scandals. And even the orchestra seemed affected, continuing to play, but with several musicians missing notes as they craned their necks to observe the spectacle. Lady Jersey, seated among the other patronesses, raised her quizzing glass to her eye with deliberate slowness, examining Eleanor as one might examine an unusual insect, and Eleanor felt that scrutiny like a physical touch. "What have you done?" her mother hissed in her ear, her voice sharp with panic and accusation. What did you do to offend him, as though Eleanor's behavior must surely be the cause of such an unprecedented slight, as though she must have committed some terrible faux pas to deserve this public rejection? Eleanor could barely force the words past her constricted throat, her voice emerging as little more than a whisper. "Nothing, Mamma. I have done nothing." But even to her own ears it sounded like a plea rather than a statement of fact. Nearby, a young lady in white muslin leaned toward her companion and stage-whispered with poorly concealed delight, "How mortifying! Refused at Almack's of all places, she will never recover from this." And the words carried across the ballroom with perfect clarity, ensuring that Eleanor heard every syllable of her own social execution. Eleanor forced herself to remain standing through sheer force of will, calling upon reserves of strength she had not known she possessed, and with tremendous effort that left her feeling as though she were holding herself together with nothing more substantial than spider silk and pride. She kept her expression composed despite the maelstrom of humiliation raging beneath the surface. She turned to her mother with a calmness that was purely performative, a mask she pulled over her shattered heart, and said quietly enough that only her mother could hear, "I wish to leave Mamma now," and those 4 words carried more dignity than any protest or tears could have conveyed. Her mother, pale as milk and with fury radiating from every line of her rigid posture, gave a single sharp nod of agreement. And together they moved toward the entrance with measured steps that belied the desperate urge to run that clawed at Eleanor's chest. They collected their cloaks from the attendants whose eyes held that particular mix of pity and fascination that servants reserve for the downfall of their betters, and Eleanor kept her chin high as they descended the steps of Almack's, though tears blurred her vision until the gas lamps along the street became nothing more than golden smears against the darkness. Inside she felt not merely rejected, but fundamentally shattered. For it was not simply the refusal itself that devastated her, but the calculated public cruelty of it, the deliberate choice to approach her before all of society only to refuse her. And the question that tormented her most was why? Why would he walk across that ballroom with such clear purpose if his intention was only to humiliate her before everyone who mattered? The carriage ride home through the dark London streets felt interminable, each turn of the wheels carrying her further from the glittering ballroom and deeper into a darkness that felt both literal and metaphorical. And the gas lamps created pools of light at regular intervals that illuminated nothing but her own misery reflected in the carriage window. The interior of the vehicle felt suffocating despite its spacious design, the air thick with unshed tears and unspoken recriminations, and Eleanor found herself acutely aware of the contrast between this dark, private space and the golden public one she had just fled, as though her emotional descent from hope to devastation had been made manifest in the physical journey from light into shadow. Her mother sat rigid across from her, alternating between rage and despair, with such rapidity that Eleanor might have found it almost amusing had she been capable of finding anything amusing in this moment. And finally, in the privacy of the carriage, Eleanor allowed the tears she had been holding back to fall, silent and hot against her cheeks. Though she made no sound, because even now she would not give voice to her pain. "We must withdraw to the country immediately," her mother declared with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You cannot show your face in London after this disgrace. The entire season is ruined. Your prospects are destroyed." And the litany of doom continued until Eleanor felt she might scream from the suffocating weight of it all. Instead, she found within herself a core of steel she had not known existed, forged perhaps in the fires of that very public humiliation, and she replied with surprising firmness that cut through her mother's spiraling panic like a knife through butter. "I have done nothing disgraceful, Mamma," she said, and each word was enunciated with perfect clarity, despite the tears still sliding down her face. The Duke's behavior was disgraceful. His choice to publicly refuse me without cause or explanation. His cruelty in approaching me at all if his intention was only to reject me before all of society. Eleanor felt her spine straighten as she spoke, felt something shifting inside her from victim to someone who would not accept that role without challenge. "I will not hide as though I am at fault," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I will not retreat to the country and cower as though I have committed some terrible sin when my only crime was accepting the attention of a man who proved himself unworthy of the courtesy I showed him." Her mother stared at her, as though seeing her daughter clearly for the first time, and in the flickering light of the passing gas lamps, Eleanor felt the first stirring of something beyond humiliation, a fierce determination that she would not allow the Duke of Ashford to define her worth or destroy her spirit, no matter how thoroughly he had attempted to accomplish both before the judging eyes of London's elite. James Rothwell sat alone in his study as the mantel clock struck 2 in the morning, the glass of brandy on the table beside him untouched despite having been poured hours ago, and he found himself replaying the scene at Almack's with the kind of obsessive repetition that only guilt and regret can inspire. He saw it all again with terrible clarity, the way Eleanor's face had transformed in the space of a heartbeat, from cautious hope to confusion to dawning horror, the precise moment when comprehension had flooded those amber eyes and turned them from warm to devastated. And the memory of that transformation felt like a physical blow to his chest that left him struggling to breathe. He dropped his head into his hands and pressed his palms against his eyes as though he could somehow erase the image burned into his mind. And the question that tormented him echoed through his thoughts with relentless persistence. "What have I done? What in God's name have I done?" James was tormented in a way he had not been since his father's death 5 years prior. That same gnawing sensation of having committed an act that could not be undone, no matter how desperately one wished to turn back time, and he acknowledged with bitter honesty that he had his reasons for behaving as he did. He always had reasons for his careful control, his methodical approach to every aspect of his life, including and especially matters of the heart. He had convinced himself over the past week that a clean break was necessary, that Lady Eleanor had begun to develop expectations based on his attentions, and that the honourable course was to make his lack of intentions absolutely clear before those expectations could deepen into something more painful. But seeing her devastation tonight had undone something fundamental in him, had cracked open the careful walls he maintained around his emotions and allowed him to see his actions for what they truly were. The look in her amber eyes would haunt him, he knew, perhaps for the rest of his life, that particular expression of betrayal and confusion that suggested she could not comprehend what she had done to deserve such treatment. And the terrible truth was that she had done nothing, absolutely nothing, except be kind and intelligent and gently hopeful in a way that had terrified him into cruelty. He stood abruptly and began to pace the length of his study like a caged animal, his footsteps muffled by the thick Turkish carpet, and with each turn he felt the weight of his error pressing down upon him with increasing force, until he thought he might collapse beneath it. He had convinced himself that a public declaration would prevent false hope, would make his position so clear that there could be no misunderstanding or lingering expectations. But now he realized with sickening clarity that what he had actually accomplished was the complete and utter destruction of an innocent woman's reputation before the most influential gathering in London. The study around him was all dark panelled wood and leather-bound books, masculine and orderly in the way that everything in his life was orderly, for James Rothwell prided himself on control and precision in all things. But tonight, that order felt oppressive rather than comforting, cold rather than reassuring, as though the very walls were judging him and finding him wanting. A fire burned low in the grate, throwing dancing shadows across the room, and outside his windows, London was silent in the way that only the very late night or very early morning can be, that peculiar hush when even the great city seems to pause and take breath. The door to his study opened without knock or warning, and Lord Peter Bancroft entered, for he had followed James home from Almack's and had apparently been waiting in the drawing-room for his friend to summon him, though no summons had come because James could not bear to face even his oldest friend after what he had done. "That was brutally done, James," Bancroft said without preamble, his voice carrying none of its usual lightness. "Even for you," and the words hung in the air like an indictment. "I know," James replied, his voice rough as though he had been shouting rather than sitting in silence. "God help me, I know. I thought I was being honourable, clear. I thought a decisive break would be kinder in the long run than allowing false hope to flourish. But instead, I destroyed her before all of society. I saw it in her face, Peter, the exact moment when I broke something in her." Bancroft moved to the sideboard and poured himself the brandy that James had ignored, taking a long swallow before responding. "Then you must make amends," he said simply, as though the solution were obvious. James laughed, a bitter sound without humour. "How does one make amends for that?" he asked. "How does one apologize for deliberately humiliating someone before everyone who matters, for crushing hope and reputation simultaneously? Tell me, Peter, because I cannot fathom it." Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through the windows of her bedroom at Hartley House with the kind of cruel brightness that seemed to mock the darkness of her situation, and for one blessed moment, before full consciousness returned, she did not remember the previous evening. But then memory crashed over her like a wave, and she felt the humiliation anew as though the Duke's words were being spoken again in the present rather than residing in the terrible past. Her lady's maid, Mary, entered quietly, bearing both the morning newspapers and a breakfast tray, and Eleanor could read the truth of her disgrace in the way the girl's eyes refused to meet hers directly. That particular combination of pity and embarrassment that servants display when their mistress has fallen from grace. The gossip columns had worked with their characteristic speed and viciousness, transforming the previous night's events into printed scandal that would outlive memory, and Eleanor's hands trembled as she unfolded the Morning Post to find her ruin documented in stark black ink. Duke of Ashford publicly declines to dance with Lady E.H. at Almack's, a most extraordinary slight, the column declared with the breathless enthusiasm that society reporters reserve for their most delicious scandals, and it continued with speculation about what offence Lady Eleanor might have committed to warrant such treatment, as though her guilt must be assumed rather than her innocence. Letters had already begun arriving in the Morning Post, carried up by footmen whose expressions ranged from sympathetic to carefully neutral, and Eleanor sorted through them with growing horror as the full scope of her social destruction became apparent. Some were sympathetic in that particular way that is almost worse than outright cruelty, dripping with pity and barely concealed satisfaction that it was Eleanor rather than the writer who had suffered such a fate, while many others were withdrawing invitations to upcoming events with various transparent excuses that could not disguise their true purpose. Lady Pemberton regretted that her musicale was now to be a much smaller affair than previously planned. The Duchess of Somerset discovered that her niece would be occupying the seat originally reserved for Eleanor at her dinner party, and Mrs. Carrington found that her country house party was quite suddenly filled to capacity, and each letter was another door closing in Eleanor's face, another confirmation that London society had judged her and found her somehow wanting. Eleanor read the papers and letters with growing horror, her social ruin now preserved in print and made permanent in a way that mere gossip could never achieve, and she felt physically sick as the reality of her situation settled over her like a shroud. But she forced herself to pick up her fork and eat the breakfast that Mary had brought, swallowing each bite with determination, even though the food tasted like ash in her mouth. She would not collapse. She told herself with fierce insistence she would not give society the satisfaction of seeing her destroyed, would not allow the Duke of Ashford or anyone else to believe that they had broken her beyond repair. The morning light flooded her feminine bedroom with its pale yellows and whites, colors chosen years ago to suggest innocence and youth, and all the qualities that made young ladies marriageable. But now that light felt harsh rather than gentle, as though her innocence were being deliberately burned away by the unforgiving scrutiny of daylight. The breakfast tray sat largely untouched despite her efforts, and papers were scattered across her coverlet like fallen leaves, each one a testament to her disgrace, each headline and withdrawal another weight added to the burden she now carried. Anger began to burn through the humiliation like fire-consuming frost, a hot and righteous fury at the Duke for his calculated cruelty, at society for its eagerness to judge and condemn her rather than him, at her own foolish heart for having hoped at all when hope had proved so dangerous. "Perhaps you should rest today, my lady," Mary said gently, her voice carrying the kind of careful concern one uses with the ill or wounded. "No callers expected, and you need not face anyone until you are ready." Eleanor lifted her chin with automatic pride and replied with surprising firmness, "No, I will receive anyone who calls. I have nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of." And even as she spoke, she felt the truth of the words settling into her bones and strengthening her spine. The door opened without warning, and her mother swept in already dressed for the day despite the early hour, her face set in lines of determination that Eleanor had seen before when decisions were being made that would affect the family. "We are leaving for Hartley Manor tomorrow," her mother announced without preamble. "I have instructed the staff to begin packing. We will withdraw from London immediately and wait for this scandal to pass. Perhaps by next season it will be forgotten enough that we might return." Eleanor felt the anger that had been building since she woke flare into something hotter and more defiant, and she met her mother's eyes with a steadiness that surprised them both as she prepared to refuse. At mid-morning, when Eleanor was still arguing with her mother about the proposed retreat to the country, a commotion outside Hartley House drew both women to the window. And what Eleanor saw there made her certain she was hallucinating, or perhaps still asleep and trapped in some fever dream conjured by her overwrought nerves. A massive wagon had stopped directly before their door, piled impossibly high with roses of the deepest crimson she had ever seen, hundreds upon hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, stacked so high that the entire conveyance seemed to overflow with blooms, and footmen in the distinctive black and silver livery of the Duke of Ashford were already beginning the process of unloading this extraordinary cargo. Eleanor stared in complete disbelief as the footman moved with practiced efficiency, lifting enormous arrangements of roses and carrying them toward the entrance of Hartley House, and within moments the first arrangements began arriving in the entrance hall, then more, then still more, until the austere space with its marble floors and classical proportions began to transform into something resembling a bower or perhaps a shrine, every surface covered with crimson blooms. The scent of roses flooded the house with overwhelming intensity, sweet and heady and almost narcotic in its strength, and Eleanor found herself torn between the beauty of it and the sheer absurdity, for this was not a normal gesture of apology but something excessive to the point of madness. Her mother came running from wherever she had gone after their argument, her face a picture of confusion and dawning hope, while the butler stood in the entrance hall looking utterly helpless as the invasion of flowers continued unabated, his usual perfect composure shattered by the unprecedented nature of the situation. Eleanor descended the stairs slowly, her anger flaring hot and bright in her chest. For did the Duke of Ashford truly believe he could purchase her forgiveness with flowers? Did he think her so shallow that a grand gesture would erase the calculated cruelty of his public rejection? Did he imagine that she would simply swoon at this display of wealth and forget that he had destroyed her reputation before all of society? Yet beneath the anger, confusion stirred like sediment at the bottom of a clear stream, clouding her certainty. For why would he do this? Why roses, and why so very many of them? Why make such a public spectacle when he could have sent a simple note of apology, or called in person to beg her forgiveness in private? The entrance hall continued its transformation as footmen carried in arrangement after arrangement, and Eleanor noticed with almost detached fascination how the thorns caught on the marble surfaces, leaving small scratches, how petals dropped to the floor like drops of blood, how the overwhelming beauty of it all was almost violent in its excess, as though the Duke were trying to bludgeon her into forgiveness through sheer visual assault. Servants gathered to whisper and stare, their usual discretion forgotten in the face of such extraordinary events. And through the still open door, Eleanor could see that passers-by on the street had stopped to gawk, that a small crowd was forming to witness this spectacle, and she realized with sinking certainty that whatever the Duke intended by this gesture, he had ensured that it would be as public as his original slight. One of the Duke's footmen approached her directly, bowing with perfect formality despite the chaos of flowers surrounding them, and his voice carried the careful neutrality of a well-trained servant delivering a message he knows to be significant. His Grace the Duke of Ashford presents his compliments and begs. Lady Eleanor will accept these tokens of his deepest regret, the footman intoned, as though he were announcing guests at a ball rather than delivering what appeared to be an entire hothouse worth of roses. Eleanor's mother gasped audibly and clutched at Eleanor's arm, her earlier despair apparently forgotten in the face of this development. 1,000 roses, her mother breathed with something approaching awe. There must be nearly that many, and Eleanor found she could not disagree with the estimate, for the entrance hall was now so full of blooms that navigation was becoming difficult. The footman extended a small, cream-colored card, and Eleanor took it with fingers that trembled despite her best efforts at composure, breaking the seal to reveal a message written in bold, masculine handwriting that she recognized from the few notes the Duke had sent during their brief acquaintance. "Forgive me," the card read with devastating simplicity. "I was a fool," and it was signed with nothing more than his title, Ashford, as though his identity required no further explanation. Eleanor stared at the card as the scent of 1,000 roses surrounded her like a physical embrace, and she felt the ground shifting beneath her feet once again, though whether toward forgiveness or deeper anger she could not yet say. Eleanor read the card once more, her eyes tracing the bold handwriting with its presumptuous simplicity, and then with deliberate precision she crumpled the cream-colored paper in her fist and turned to face the butler, who still stood helplessly amid the sea of crimson blooms that had invaded his orderly domain. "Return every rose to the Duke with my compliments," she instructed, her voice calm and cold as winter ice. "Tell his footman that Lady Eleanor does not accept gifts from the Duke of Ashford. Not today, and not ever." And she watched as the butler's eyes widened slightly in surprise before his professional mask reasserted itself. The butler hesitated for the briefest moment, his gaze sweeping across the entrance hall with its hundreds upon hundreds of roses, and Eleanor could practically see him calculating the sheer logistics of returning such an enormous delivery, the time it would take, the wagons that would be required, the spectacle it would create. But years of training won out over practical concerns, and he bowed his acceptance. "Very good, my lady," he said simply, and began issuing quiet instructions to the footman who had been standing uncertain amid the floral chaos. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her bedroom and positioned herself at the window that overlooked the street, watching with grim satisfaction as the process of removal began, each arrangement carried back out through the door with the same care that had brought it in, loaded back onto the wagons that still waited at the curb. The Duke's liveried footmen working with admirable efficiency to undo what they had just accomplished. She felt a fierce pleasure in the rejection, a sense of having seized back some small measure of control in a situation where she had been rendered utterly powerless. For if the Duke of Ashford thought that grand gestures could erase the calculated cruelty of public humiliation, then he was very much mistaken. Yet even as she watched the roses disappear back into the wagons, part of her mind could not help but wonder at the extravagance of it all, for 1,000 roses must have cost a fortune even for a man of the Duke's considerable wealth, and more than that, such a delivery required significant planning and coordination. When had he arranged this, she wondered? Had he placed the order the very night of Almack's after leaving her standing devastated on that ballroom floor? Had he lain awake consumed by guilt and decided that flowers would somehow make amends? Had he truly believed that she would simply accept them and consider the matter closed? The questions circled through her mind like birds seeking a place to land, but she pushed them aside and focused instead on hardening her resolve, on building walls around the confusion and hurt that the roses had unexpectedly stirred, for she would not be bought with blooms, no matter how beautiful or how numerous. The house that had been briefly transformed into something resembling an indoor garden returned gradually to its normal state, the marble floors reappearing as arrangements were removed, the classical proportions of the entrance hall reasserting themselves as the floral invasion was reversed, and Eleanor found that the absence of the roses was almost as startling as their presence had been, as though the space itself had been holding its breath and could now exhale. Scattered petals on the floor were the only evidence that remained, crimson against white marble, and Eleanor knew the maids would sweep them away within the hour, erasing even this small trace of the Duke's gesture. Through her window she could see that London society was watching the spectacle with avid interest, faces appearing at windows across the street, passers-by slowing their pace to observe. And Eleanor knew with certainty that this rejection would be discussed in every drawing-room by afternoon, that the gossip columns would report it tomorrow with the same breathless enthusiasm they had devoted to her humiliation. "Eleanor, are you certain?" Her mother's voice came from the doorway, tentative and worried in equal measure. "The Duke is clearly attempting to make amends." "1,000 roses, Eleanor. Surely that demonstrates the sincerity of his regret." Eleanor turned from the window to face her mother, her expression cold and implacable as stone. "1,000 roses do not erase what he did, Mamma," she said, each word precise and controlled. "He humiliated me before all of London. He destroyed my reputation with deliberate cruelty, and I will not be mollified by flowers no matter how many he sends or how much they cost." Her father appeared behind her mother, his presence unexpected, for he usually avoided what he termed the theatrical dramatics of women, but now he stepped into the room and regarded Eleanor with an expression she could not quite decipher. "Good girl," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of approval that Eleanor had rarely heard directed at her. "Make him work for it." And those 4 words settled into her chest like a benediction, like permission to hold firm in her resolve rather than capitulating to the pressure she knew would come. The next morning, Eleanor found herself standing at her bedroom window earlier than was her custom, telling herself that she was merely enjoying the spring air and had no particular reason for choosing this spot at this hour. But when the wagoners arrived precisely at 10 o'clock bearing another impossible load of roses, she had to acknowledge that some part of her had been expecting them. This time the blooms were white rather than crimson, pure as snow or perhaps as apologies, and there were just as many as the day before, 1,000 perfect white roses that transformed the street outside Hartley House into something resembling a scene from a fairy tale, though whether she was the princess or the villain of this particular story, Eleanor could not yet determine. Again she instructed the butler to refuse them, her voice steady despite the flutter of something strange and unfamiliar in her chest. And again the Duke's footmen, with their black and silver livery, began the process of loading the roses back onto wagons, while a growing crowd of curious onlookers gathered to witness the spectacle. Eleanor watched from her window as people stopped their morning routines to observe, as the crowd grew from a handful to dozens, as carriages slowed to allow their occupants a better view, and she realized with a mixture of horror and fascination that her refusal had become as much a public performance as the Duke's gesture. By afternoon, the entire city seemed to be talking about what the gossip columns had already begun calling the Rose War, the unprecedented conflict between the Duke of Ashford and Lady Eleanor Hartley, and every drawing-room in London buzzed with speculation about how long it could possibly continue and what it all meant. Eleanor felt a flicker of something beyond the anger that had sustained her through the previous day, something that felt dangerously close to curiosity. For the Duke was persisting in a way that most men would not. Most gentlemen would have accepted a single rejection as final and moved on to less complicated prospects. But he was proving unexpectedly stubborn. She maintained her resolve with conscious effort, reminding herself of the humiliation at Almack's, of the cruel deliberateness of his public rejection, of the fact that flowers could not undo damage once done, yet she could not deny that she found herself waiting by the window each morning, wondering with reluctant anticipation whether roses would come again and what color they might be. The street outside Hartley House had become a kind of daily theatre where Londoners gathered to watch the unfolding drama, and Eleanor observed with bemused detachment as vendors began appearing to sell refreshments to the crowd, as though the delivery and rejection of roses had become entertainment worthy of an admission price. It was a spectacle in the truest sense, a story that Londoners followed with the same avid interest they might devote to a serialized novel, speculating about the next installment and debating the motivations of the principal characters. And Eleanor found herself simultaneously appalled and oddly flattered by the attention. The weather remained crisp and clear as March settled into its stride, daffodils blooming in the squares and parks, while 1,000 roses arrived daily at Hartley House, only to be returned within the hour, and the juxtaposition of the natural spring flowers with the extravagant hothouse blooms seemed to Eleanor a metaphor for something she could not quite articulate. Her younger sister Beatrice burst into her room that afternoon with the kind of barely contained excitement that only an 18-year-old could muster, her eyes bright with vicarious romance, and her cheeks flushed from having run up the stairs in a manner their mother would have deemed most unladylike. "Eleanor, you are famous," Beatrice exclaimed, dropping onto the bed with complete disregard for her muslin gown. "Everyone is talking about you and the Duke. It is terribly romantic." And Eleanor felt irritation flare at this characterization of what she considered a prolonged insult. "It is not romantic," she snapped with more vehemence than she had intended. "It is absurd. He is being absurd, and I am simply refusing to reward his assumption that I can be bought with flowers." But Beatrice was not so easily deterred, her romantic nature finding nourishment in the very aspects that Eleanor found most troubling. "He must truly care to go to such lengths," Beatrice insisted, leaning forward with the earnest intensity of youth. "No man sends 2,000 roses without deep feeling. Eleanor, perhaps he made a terrible mistake at Almack's, but surely these flowers prove that he regrets it desperately." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to explain that grand gestures were not the same as genuine remorse, that public displays of wealth were not equivalent to private acts of contrition, but she found the words would not come. For some traitorous part of her mind was whispering that perhaps Beatrice had a point. Perhaps no man would go to such extraordinary lengths unless driven by feelings more profound than simple guilt. Retry CP. In his study, James Rothwell sat across the broad mahogany desk from his secretary Mr. Pemberton, a meticulous man of middle years who had managed the Duke's affairs for the better part of a decade, and who now looked distinctly uncomfortable as he presented the accounting ledgers documenting the mounting costs of what the household staff had begun calling the Rose Campaign. "Your Grace," Pemberton began with the careful delicacy of a man delivering unwelcome news, "the expenses are becoming quite substantial, not merely the cost of the roses themselves, though they are considerable given that we are procuring them from hothouses across England, and have even engaged suppliers in France to meet the daily demand, but also the logistics of transportation, the wages for additional footmen, the coordination required to ensure delivery at precisely the same hour each morning." James waved his hand in dismissal before the secretary could continue itemizing costs, the gesture conveying both his lack of concern for the financial implications and his desire to end this particular conversation. "I do not care about the expense," he said flatly. "Order another 1,000 for tomorrow and continue the daily deliveries until I instruct otherwise." And Pemberton bowed his acceptance, though his expression suggested he thought his employer had taken leave of his senses. After the secretary departed, James sat alone staring at the papers scattered across his desk, maps marking the locations of every significant hothouse within a day's journey of London. Schedules detailing the complex choreography required to gather and deliver 1,000 fresh roses each morning, correspondence with flower merchants who had initially thought him mad, but who now competed eagerly for his business, and he acknowledged to himself that this entire enterprise had evolved into something resembling a military campaign. Lord Peter Bancroft arrived without appointment, but also without surprise, for he had been calling daily since the rose deliveries began, driven by a combination of genuine concern for his friend and frank curiosity about how long this extraordinary situation could possibly continue. "You are becoming obsessed, James," Bancroft announced as he settled into the leather chair opposite the desk without waiting for invitation. 3,000 roses, and she has refused them all. Perhaps you should abandon this strategy and call on her personally. Speak with her face to face rather than communicating through flowers. James looked up from the maps and schedules that had consumed his morning and met his friend's eyes with an intensity that made Bancroft shift uncomfortably. "She will not receive me," James stated with absolute certainty. "I destroyed her reputation before all of society. Peter, I humiliated her in the cruelest possible way. She will not grant me a private audience, and I cannot blame her for that. This is the only way I can communicate my sincerity, the only language that might eventually convince her that my regret is genuine." Bancroft studied his friend with the assessing gaze of someone who had known him since their school days at Eton and who could read the subtle signs that others missed. "Or your madness," he suggested with a slight smile, intended to soften the observation, though his eyes remained serious. James felt his own mouth curve in response, a rueful acknowledgement of the truth beneath the jest. "Perhaps they are the same thing," he admitted. "Perhaps there is no meaningful distinction between sincere regret and obsessive determination. Perhaps I have crossed some line where guilt becomes something else entirely." What troubled James most was not the expense or the logistical complexity or even the growing spectacle that his roses had created, but rather the realization that had crept up on him gradually over the past 3 days. The understanding that he was driven not merely by guilt over what he had done, but by something deeper and more dangerous. He was realizing with uncomfortable clarity what he had lost in that moment at Almack's. Not just Eleanor's good opinion or the possibility of a convenient marriage, but the chance to know her, to discover what thoughts lived behind those amber eyes, to understand what combination of strength and grace allowed her to stand so firmly against him when most women would have capitulated after the first delivery. Her refusals intrigued him in ways he had not anticipated, each rejection revealing something about her character that made him more, rather than less, determined to win her forgiveness. And he found himself thinking about her at odd moments throughout the day, wondering what she was doing, whether she was watching from her window when the roses arrived, what expression crossed her face when she ordered them returned. Her strength drew him in despite himself, or perhaps because of himself, for James had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who bent to his will, who agreed with his opinions, who shaped themselves to his preferences, and Eleanor's absolute refusal to do any of those things was as refreshing as it was frustrating. The ordered space of his study had become devoted entirely to this chaotic pursuit, every surface covered with documents related to the rose deliveries, and through the tall windows, morning light illuminated London going about its business, while inside, a duke plotted his campaign with the kind of single-minded focus he had previously reserved for matters of state and estate management. 5,000 roses had now been delivered to Hartley House, and 5,000 roses had been returned to the Duke of Ashford. And Eleanor had begun to feel as though she were trapped in some strange, repeating dream, where each morning brought the same impossible spectacle, and each morning she responded with the same inflexible refusal. Her father sent word through a footman that he wished to speak with her privately in his study, an unusual request that sent a flutter of apprehension through Eleanor's chest, for the Earl of Hartley was not a man given to involving himself in what he termed the emotional theatrics of his household unless something of genuine importance required his attention. She made her way to his study with reluctant steps, wondering what pronouncement he intended to deliver, whether he would side with her mother's demands for immediate retreat to the country, or whether he had some third position that she had not yet considered. The study was exactly as it had always been, masculine and book-lined with the comfortable smell of tobacco and old leather, a globe in the corner that Eleanor had spun countless times as a child, while her father explained the wider world beyond London's drawing rooms, and she felt transported back to her younger self as she settled into the leather chair across from his desk. Rain pattered against the tall windows in a steady rhythm that seemed to underscore the seriousness of whatever conversation was about to unfold, and Eleanor could see through the glass that another delivery of roses sat outside, awaiting her inevitable refusal. Today's blooms a delicate pink that reminded her of sunrise, or perhaps of hope, though she pushed that thought aside as soon as it formed. Her father regarded her in silence for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental, and when he finally spoke, his question was not at all what she had expected. "Do you want to forgive him, Eleanor?" he asked with the directness that had always characterized their private conversations. "Or do you want to punish him?" And she must answer honestly, because the distinction matters more than you might think. Eleanor was taken aback by the question, her mouth opening to respond with automatic defiance before she realized that she did not actually know the answer. For she had been so focused on her righteous anger, so consumed by the justified fury of having been wronged, that she had not separated in her mind the desire for justice from the desire for vengeance. She sat in her father's leather chair, feeling suddenly like a child again, uncertain and seeking guidance from the man who had always helped her think through complicated problems with clarity and precision, and his question unsettled her precisely because it forced her to examine motivations she had not yet interrogated. "He wronged you grievously," her father continued, when she did not immediately respond. "No question about that. Eleanor, what he did at Almack's was cruel and calculated, and you have every right to your anger. But 5 days of persistence, 5,000 roses, that suggests something beyond mere social obligation, that suggests genuine contrition." Eleanor found her voice at last, though it came out sharper than she intended. "Or stubbornness," she countered. "Perhaps he simply cannot bear that someone has refused him. Perhaps his pride is wounded, and he wishes to win this contest regardless of any actual feeling." Her father nodded slowly, acknowledging the validity of her interpretation. "Perhaps," he agreed, "but consider Eleanor. What does forgiveness actually mean? Must he suffer proportionally to your suffering before you can grant it? And if so, how do you measure when the debt is paid? How many roses equal one public humiliation? How many days of rejection balance one moment of cruelty?" The questions landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through Eleanor's carefully constructed certainty. For she had not considered forgiveness in such concrete terms, had not attempted to quantify what would be sufficient penance, or whether penance was even what she truly sought. "Does he need to feel exactly as terrible as you felt that night at Almack's?" Her father pressed with gentle relentlessness. "Does he need to experience equivalent public shame? And if he does, then no amount of roses will achieve that goal. But if forgiveness means something else, if it means releasing anger because holding it has become more burdensome than the original wrong, then perhaps you need to ask yourself what you are actually protecting by maintaining this position." "I do not know, Papa," Eleanor said quietly, the admission feeling like defeat and relief in equal measure. "I do not know what I want anymore. I thought I wanted him to understand the depth of his cruelty, to see that actions have consequences, and that people cannot simply be discarded when they become inconvenient. But now I find myself waiting each morning to see if roses will come, and feeling strangely disappointed on the mornings when I wake before they arrive, and I do not understand what that means." Her father's expression softened with something that looked like sympathy mixed with recognition, as though he had been waiting for precisely this admission. "That uncertainty," he said gently, "that confusion about your own desires, that is often the first sign that forgiveness is becoming possible, not because the wrong was any less wrong or because sufficient time has passed, but because you are beginning to see the person who wronged you as something more complex than simply the author of your pain. On the 7th day, the roses arrived in a rainbow of color, every shade mixed together in arrangements that seemed to capture light itself. Crimson and white and pink and yellow and coral, all intertwined in a display so breathtakingly beautiful that even Eleanor's carefully maintained anger faltered at the sight. The Duke had varied his approach for the first time since the deliveries began, and this departure from pattern felt significant in ways Eleanor could not immediately articulate, as though he were demonstrating that his commitment was not mere stubborn repetition, but something more thoughtful, more deliberate. With the roses came a new note, longer than the first terse message, and Eleanor broke the seal with fingers that trembled slightly, despite her determination to remain unmoved. "I do not ask you to forget what I did," the note began, in that bold handwriting she was beginning to recognize as easily as her own. "I ask only that you allow me the chance to explain why I was such a coward. If you refuse these roses as you have the others, I will understand. But I will send 1,000 more tomorrow, and every day after, until you believe I mean what I say." And it was signed simply Ashford, as though his title were both identity and confession. Eleanor read the note multiple times, her eyes catching on the word coward with each pass, for the Duke of Ashford had called himself a coward in his own hand, had admitted weakness and fear in a way that proud men rarely did, and the admission surprised her more than all the roses combined. She had expected continued apology, perhaps escalating declarations of regret, but this acknowledgement of his own flawed humanity was something different entirely, something that penetrated the armor of her anger in a way that grand gestures alone could not. The rainbow of roses transformed the entrance hall into something magical and fairy tale-like, as though a garden had somehow grown overnight within the austere marble space, and servants paused in their morning work to admire the display with open wonder, whispering to each other about the Duke's persistence and Lady Eleanor's remarkable resolve. The effect was different from the monochrome displays of previous days, more personal somehow, as though each color had been chosen to convey some specific meaning, and Eleanor found herself wondering what the Duke had thought as he selected them, whether he had personally instructed the florists, or whether he had simply ordered variety without considering the implication. Spring sunshine streamed through the tall windows, illuminating petals with such intensity that they seemed to glow from within, and for the first time since the deliveries began, Eleanor felt her hand hesitate as she reached for the bell to summon the butler. Her fingers hovered in the air while conflicting impulses warred within her chest, the desire to maintain her position against the growing curiosity about what explanation the Duke could possibly offer for his cruelty. And she stood frozen in indecision for what felt like an eternity, though it could only have been moments. She let the roses stay for an hour, telling herself that she was simply enjoying their beauty, that admiring flowers did not constitute forgiveness or even softening, but knowing in her heart that allowing them to remain even temporarily represented a crack in the foundation of her resolve. Beatrice found her standing amid the rainbow of blooms, her sister's face lit with delight at the spectacular display, and she moved through the arrangements with the unself-conscious pleasure of someone too young to understand the complicated emotions they represented. "Eleanor, they are beautiful," Beatrice whispered, as though speaking too loudly might somehow break the spell. "Will you not keep just one? A single rose to acknowledge his effort, if not to forgive his wrong." Eleanor felt torn between her sister's simple logic and her own more complicated feelings, between the desire to hold firm and the exhaustion of maintaining constant anger. "I cannot," she said at last, though her voice lacked the conviction it had carried on previous days. Keeping one means I am softening, and I am not ready to soften. Not yet. Not when I still remember so vividly how it felt to stand before all of society and be rejected without cause or explanation. Beatrice looked disappointed, but did not argue further, and Eleanor finally rang for the butler and gave the familiar instruction to return every rose to the Duke, watching from her window as the rainbow was disassembled and loaded back onto wagons, while the daily crowd observed with commentary she could not hear but could easily imagine. Yet after the wagons had departed and the entrance hall had been restored to its normal state, Eleanor descended the stairs and found amid the scattered petals that remained a single bloom that had somehow been overlooked in the removal, deep crimson like the first day's roses, and she picked it up with careful fingers. She told herself she would simply discard it, that one rose meant nothing in the context of 7,000, but instead she carried it to her bedroom and pressed a single petal between the pages of her diary, preserving it there like a secret she was keeping from herself, evidence of a softening she was not yet prepared to acknowledge aloud. Eleanor attended Lady Pemberton's musical on the 8th evening of the rose deliveries with considerable reluctance, knowing she could not indefinitely avoid society without confirming her mother's fears about permanent social ruin, yet dreading the whispers and pitying glances that had followed her since Almack's. What she encountered instead left her bewildered and oddly disoriented, for the opinion of London society had shifted with the characteristic fickleness that made the ton both fascinating and frustrating, transforming her from object of schadenfreude to subject of romantic fascination in the space of a single week. Ladies who had deliberately cut her in the street after her public humiliation now approached her with eager warmth, their eyes bright with curiosity and their questions tumbling over one another in their haste to extract details about the Duke's unprecedented campaign. Eleanor navigated this sudden attention with confusion, uncertain whether she was being honored or merely providing entertainment, and she found herself at the center of every conversation, despite having contributed nothing more than her presence and her continued refusals. The drawing-room at Pemberton House was filled with London's elite, the season's most fashionable gathering of titles and wealth, and piano music provided a genteel backdrop to conversations that kept circling back to the same topic, regardless of how Eleanor attempted to redirect them. Ladies in spring gowns of pastel silk and delicate muslin clustered around her like she had suddenly become the season's most interesting person, their attention a stark contrast to the cold shoulders she had endured immediately after Almack's, and Eleanor recognized with growing unease that society was fickle and followed the best story regardless of truth or justice. "My dear Lady Eleanor," Lady Pemberton herself gushed as she swept across the room, trailing expensive French perfume and barely suppressed excitement. "It is like something from a novel. 1,000 roses every day. How many has it been now? 8,000, I think someone said. The Duke must be utterly devoted to you." Eleanor replied with deliberate coolness, hoping to discourage the romantic interpretation that was rapidly becoming accepted fact. "I have not kept count, as I have refused them all," she said clearly. "Every single rose has been returned to the Duke without exception. There is no romance in flowers that are not accepted." But her correction seemed only to fuel rather than dampen the enthusiasm, as though her refusals were themselves part of the romantic narrative rather than a rejection of it. And she felt control of the story slipping from her hands like water through cupped palms. Another lady leaned forward with the kind of conspiratorial intimacy that society women used when discussing matters they considered deliciously scandalous. "But surely you must forgive him soon," the woman insisted, as though Eleanor's forgiveness were something owed rather than something earned. "Such devotion deserves reward, does it not? No man sends 8,000 roses without the deepest feeling." Eleanor felt her irritation flare at this presumption, and replied with more sharpness than was perhaps polite. "Devotion?" she asked with an edge to her voice. "Or guilty conscience? How do you distinguish between a man who loves and a man who simply wishes to assuage his own guilt over cruel behavior?" The question hung in the air for a moment before being swept away by the tide of romantic speculation that seemed to have captured the collective imagination of London's ladies, and Eleanor realized with frustrated clarity that her refusal to forgive was being recast as romantic stubbornness rather than justified anger, as though she were the heroine of some Gothic novel playing hard to win rather than a woman standing firm on principle. She resented this reinterpretation, even as she recognized that her social standing had paradoxically improved rather than deteriorated. For whereas a week ago she had been pitied as the woman rejected by the Duke, now she was envied as the woman for whom the Duke was apparently willing to bankrupt every hothouse in England. The narrative had shifted beneath her feet, and she found herself cast in a role she had not auditioned for, no longer the victim of public humiliation, but the prize in some grand romantic gesture, and she was uncertain whether this represented progress or simply a different form of objectification. Throughout the evening she heard fragments of conversation that revealed how thoroughly the story had taken hold of society's imagination. Ladies discussing the Duke's persistence with the same breathless enthusiasm they might devote to the latest sensation novel, gentlemen placing wagers in their clubs about how many days Eleanor would hold out before capitulating, everyone treating the entire situation as entertainment rather than the complicated tangle of hurt and pride and confusion that Eleanor knew it to be her. The warmth of society's attention contrasted so sharply with the cold shoulders after Almack's that Eleanor felt she had stepped through some invisible boundary into an alternate reality where the rules had changed without warning, and she struggled to maintain her equilibrium in the face of this unexpected shift. A young lady barely out of the schoolroom approached with stars in her eyes and declared that Eleanor was the luckiest woman in London to have captured the heart of the most eligible duke in England, and Eleanor had to bite her tongue against the reply that she had not captured anything, that she had been publicly humiliated and was now being publicly pursued, and that neither situation had much to do with her own desires or agency. She left the musicale earlier than politeness strictly required, pleading a headache that was not entirely fabricated, and in the carriage home she found herself reviewing the evening with mounting frustration, for she realized that society's transformation of her humiliation into romance had created a new form of pressure, an expectation that she would eventually soften and accept the Duke's suit because that was what the story demanded, and refusal to do so would cast her as the villain rather than him. With the 12,000 roses came something different, a sealed letter thick with pages that the Duke's footman presented to Eleanor with unusual solemnity, explaining that His Grace hoped Lady Eleanor would read it even if she refused the flowers, as she had refused all the others. Eleanor took the letter with hands that betrayed her composure by trembling slightly, the weight of the folded pages feeling substantial in her palm, and she gave her customary instruction to return the roses, though her voice lacked the firmness it had carried in previous days. She climbed to her bedroom with the letter clutched against her chest, her heart beating with an intensity that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the stairs, and once safely behind her closed door, she found herself staring at the sealed packet as though it might contain either salvation or damnation, and she could not predict which. For hours she debated with herself, the letter sitting on her dressing table like an unexploded munition while twilight deepened into evening and candles were lit against the gathering dark, and she invented a dozen reasons why she should not read it, why opening it would represent a weakening of her resolve, why whatever excuse the Duke offered could not possibly justify his cruelty. Yet curiosity gnawed at her with persistent teeth, eroding the certainty she had maintained for nearly 2 weeks, and finally, As rain began to streak the windows, she could bear it no longer. She curled into the window seat overlooking the street where tomorrow's roses would inevitably arrive, drawing her knees up beneath her skirts like a child seeking comfort, and broke the seal with fingers that trembled more obviously now that there was no one to witness her agitation. The letter was long, written in the Duke's bold handwriting that covered page after page in lines of black ink that seemed to pulse with urgency, and Eleanor read it once quickly, her eyes racing over the words in her haste to understand, then again more slowly as the full weight of what he was confessing settled over her like a physical burden. "Lady Eleanor," the letter began without preamble or elaborate greeting, "I owe you an explanation, though it excuses nothing I have done, and what follows is not an attempt to justify my behavior, but merely to provide context that you deserve to have, even if you choose to do nothing with it. 3 years ago I was engaged to Lady Caroline Ashworth, the daughter of the Marquis of Pembroke, and I believed myself in love with all the naive certainty of a young man who has never truly been tested. 1 week before our wedding I returned unexpectedly early from a business matter in the country and discovered her in a compromising position with my own brother, my younger brother, whom I had trusted absolutely, and the double betrayal shattered something fundamental in me that I do not think has ever properly healed." Eleanor felt her breath catch as she read this revelation, her mind immediately conjuring the scene the Duke must have witnessed, the devastation he must have felt, and despite her anger, she found unwelcome sympathy stirring in her chest. The letter continued in that same direct style, each sentence laying bare wounds that Eleanor suspected the Duke had never before put into words. "I vowed that day never to be vulnerable again, never to care too deeply or trust too completely, never to give anyone the power to hurt me as I had been hurt. And I constructed walls around my heart with such determination that I convinced myself they were wisdom rather than cowardice. When I met you, Lady Eleanor, when I found myself drawn to your wit and warmth, when I realized that you made me laugh in a way I had not laughed since before that terrible discovery, I panicked in the most profound sense of the word." The Duke's handwriting seemed to press harder into the paper at this point, the letters darker as though emotion had translated into physical force. "I convinced myself that I was being honorable by severing our acquaintance publicly and definitively, that a clean break would prevent false hope and save us both from greater pain down the road. That decisive action was better than allowing expectations to develop that I could never fulfill. Instead, I became the very thing I despised, someone who inflicts pain to protect himself, someone who wounds the innocent because he has been wounded, someone who mistakes cruelty for strength." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes as she read, her anger complicated now by understanding though not yet dissolved, and the pages rustled in her hands as though they too were trembling with the weight of confession. "You deserved honesty in private, not cruelty in public," the letter went on. "You deserved to be told that my fear prevented me from pursuing you further, not to be rejected before all of society, as though you were somehow unworthy when the unworthiness was entirely mine. I cannot undo what I did, Eleanor. I cannot take back the words or erase the humiliation, but I can spend however long it takes proving that I see my error, that I recognize the profound difference between protecting oneself and destroying another. The roses are not payment, for they could never be sufficient. They are penance and promise, proof that I will persist in demonstrating my regret until you believe it genuine." The letter concluded with simply his initials rather than his title, J.R., as though he were writing not as the Duke of Ashford, but as James Rothwell, merely a man who had made a catastrophic mistake and hoped desperately for forgiveness he knew he had not earned. Eleanor did not sleep that night, could not sleep, for every time she closed her eyes she saw the words of the Duke's letter written across the darkness of her eyelids, like accusations or perhaps confessions, and she found herself pacing the length of her bedroom with restless energy that had nowhere else to go. She reread the letter so many times that she began to memorize passages without intending to, phrases about betrayal and fear, and walls built for protection that became prisons. And with each reading, her understanding shifted slightly, like a kaleidoscope turning to reveal new patterns in familiar fragments. The candles burned down slowly as the night progressed, their flames guttering and reforming in the drafts that crept through even the best-maintained townhouse. And Eleanor watched the wax pool and drip with the same fascinated detachment she might have given to watching her own certainty melt away. She thought about betrayal, about what it must have felt like to discover the woman you loved and the brother you trusted in that terrible moment of revelation, and she recognized with uncomfortable honesty that such a wound would not heal cleanly or quickly, that it would leave scars that shaped all future choice. She thought about fear and the walls people build to protect themselves, and in this thinking she recognized something of herself in the Duke's confession. For had she not also been afraid of vulnerability, of hoping too much, of allowing herself to believe that someone might truly want her for herself, rather than for her family connections or her father's modest fortune? The realization unsettled her because it complicated the neat division she had maintained between his wrongdoing and her righteousness, introducing shades of grey into what she had preferred to see as stark black and white. By the time dawn began to lighten the sky from black to grey to the pale pink of early morning, Eleanor was exhausted in body and spirit, but had reached no firm conclusion except that her anger was more complicated now, layered with understanding that she had not possessed before and could not simply dismiss. She wanted to hold on to her righteous indignation because it had been her armor these past 12 days, the thing that kept her upright and resolute when society's opinion shifted like sand beneath her feet. But the Duke's honesty had penetrated that armor in a way that flowers alone could not. She found herself thinking of the crimson petal pressed between the pages of her diary, that small secret acknowledgement that something in her had already begun to soften, and she wondered when exactly that softening had started, whether it was the rainbow roses or the word coward in his first long note, or some earlier moment she had not recognized as significant. She thought of 12,000 roses, of the extraordinary persistence required to maintain such a campaign, of the planning and expense and sheer stubborn determination it represented, and she asked herself whether a man who cared nothing beyond assuaging his guilt would truly go to such lengths. The word coward echoed in her mind, and she considered how much courage it must have taken for the proud Duke of Ashford to admit weakness, to acknowledge fear, to lay bare wounds he had clearly never before revealed, and that courage of confession moved her in ways the roses themselves had not. She was not ready to forgive, she told herself firmly as she stood at her window watching London wake below, not ready to simply absolve him of the pain he had caused, or to pretend that public humiliation could be erased by private explanation, but neither was she certain she wanted to refuse forever, to hold on to anger until it turned bitter and consumed her from within. "What do I want?" She spoke aloud to her empty room, her voice sounding strange after hours of silence, revenge or justice, or just to not hurt anymore, to not carry this weight of humiliation and wounded pride like a stone in my chest. The question hung in the air unanswered because Eleanor did not know the answer, had perhaps never known it, and she realized that her father had been right when he asked whether she wanted to forgive or to punish. She picked up the letter again, though she could have recited most of it from memory by now, and ran her finger over the signature at the bottom, just initials J and R, as though the Duke could not bear to write his full name or title, as though he were signing as simply a man rather than as the powerful peer who had wronged her. "James Rothwell," she whispered to the empty room. Who are you really? Are you the cruel man who rejected me at Almack's, or the wounded man who wrote this letter? Or are you somehow both at once? And if you are both, then which version do I respond to? Outside her window she could hear London coming to life, vendors calling their wares in the streets below, carriages beginning to rattle over cobblestones, the city shaking off sleep and preparing for another day. And Eleanor knew with weary certainty that another 1,000 roses would arrive within the hour, that the pattern would continue unless she took some action to alter it. The house was silent around her. That peculiar quiet of early morning, when servants were just beginning to stir, but the family still slept. And in that silence, Eleanor felt the full weight of the decision that awaited her, for she could not remain suspended in this liminal space forever, refusing but softening, angry but understanding, hurt but curious about the man behind the flowers. When the 15,000 roses arrived in the pale pink of dawn, or perhaps of new beginnings, Eleanor stood at her window as she had every morning for the past 2 weeks and watched the familiar wagons roll to a stop before Hartley House. But this time, when the footmen began their well-practiced routine of unloading, she did not immediately reach for the bell to summon her butler. She stood motionless for a long moment, her hand hovering in the air as though suspended by invisible strings, while some invisible battle was fought and won within her chest. And then, with sudden decision, she turned from the window and descended the stairs to the entrance hall, where roses were already beginning to accumulate. She did something she had not done in 15 days. She allowed them to remain, instructed the butler with a voice that trembled only slightly that these flowers were to be kept and arranged throughout the house, and watched as surprise and poorly concealed delight crossed the faces of servants who had spent 2 weeks loading and unloading identical cargo. Eleanor did not acknowledge the roses publicly, did not send thanks or any message of acceptance, but the simple act of allowing them to stay felt momentous in a way that made her heart pound against her ribs like something trying to escape. She retreated to her father's study and took up pen and paper, staring at the blank page for what felt like hours, though it could only have been minutes, composing and discarding a dozen versions of what she wanted to say before finally settling on brevity. "Your Grace," she wrote in her careful, slanting hand, "I have read your letter. I will keep today's roses. This is not forgiveness, but it is acknowledgement." And she signed it simply E.H., as he had signed his letter with only initials, a small mirror of his vulnerability that cost her more than she wanted to admit. She sealed the note and sent it via footman to the Duke's residence in Grosvenor Square before she could second-guess herself. And as she watched the servant depart, she felt simultaneously like she had taken control of the situation, and like she had surrendered something precious she could never reclaim. The roses were pale pink like dawn, or like the blush on a young girl's cheeks, delicate and lovely, and filling the entrance hall with a fragrance that was somehow less overwhelming than the deeper colors had been, more subtle and therefore more insidious in the way it wound itself through the house. Eleanor walked among the arrangements that servants were placing on every available surface, trailing her fingers over petals that felt like silk beneath her gloves, and something in her chest loosened just slightly, as though a fist that had been clenched tight for 2 weeks had begun to uncurl. Fear and hope warred within her in equal measure. Fear that she was being foolish, and hope that perhaps she was being brave, and she could not yet determine which emotion would ultimately triumph. The Hartley entrance hall was finally allowed to keep its transformation after 15 days of temporary beauty immediately undone, and servants sepulchred as they arranged roses in crystal vases and porcelain bowls, clearly pleased that their mistress had softened, even if she would not admit to softening, and their pleasure added to the sense that something significant had shifted. The scent was overwhelming in the best possible way, beautiful and heady and impossible to ignore. And Eleanor found that she kept returning to the entrance hall throughout the morning, on various invented errands, simply to walk among the flowers and remind herself that they were real and that she had chosen to keep them. Outside, the watching crowd that had gathered faithfully every morning for 2 weeks erupted in cheers when the Duke's wagons departed empty for the first time, understanding immediately what the empty wagons signified, and Eleanor heard the noise from inside the house, and felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and something else she could not quite name. The story that all of London had been following like a serialized novel had acquired a new chapter, and Eleanor knew that by afternoon every drawing room in the city would be discussing her capitulation or perhaps her mercy, debating what it meant and what would happen next. Spring had fully arrived while Eleanor had been consumed by the daily ritual of rejection, and now London was blooming with daffodils and early roses in gardens and window boxes, the entire city seeming to celebrate the season of renewal just as Eleanor allowed the first small possibility of her own renewal. Beatrice found her standing among the pale pink roses in the entrance hall, and her sister's face was alight with excitement and vindication, the expression of someone who has been proven right after arguing a position for weeks. "You kept them," Beatrice exclaimed, as she rushed down the stairs with complete disregard for the dignified dissent their mother had drilled into them. "Oh, Eleanor, does this mean you will see him? Will you receive him if he calls? Have you forgiven him?" Eleanor felt a smile tugging at her lips, despite her best efforts at maintaining dignity. "It means I am tired of returning flowers," she replied with deliberate coolness, nothing more than that. Beatrice, do not read romance into simple exhaustion. Her sister laughed with the uncomplicated delight of someone who sees clearly what others try to hide. "You are the worst liar, sister," Beatrice declared. "I can see it in your face that this means something, that something has changed," and Eleanor found she could not maintain her facade in the face of such direct observation. "Perhaps," she admitted with a reluctant smile that felt like the first genuine expression of pleasure she had allowed herself in weeks. "Perhaps something has changed, but I do not yet know what it means or where it will lead, only that I could not continue refusing forever without becoming something bitter and small." James Rothwell was reviewing estate ledgers in his study when the footman returned from Hartley House bearing Eleanor's note, and he took the folded paper with hands that began to shake before he had even broken the seal. For the simple fact that she had sent a reply at all was more than he had allowed himself to expect. He dismissed the footman with an absent wave and stared at the cream-colored paper for a long moment before finally opening it, his heart beating with an intensity that would have embarrassed him had anyone been present to witness it, and when he read the brief message, his vision actually blurred with relief so profound it felt physical. "She kept the roses," the words repeated in his mind like a litany or perhaps a prayer. After 15 days of rejection, she kept them. She kept them. She kept them. He read the note 10 times in rapid succession, analyzing every word as though it were a legal document requiring close interpretation, lingering over each phrase and trying to extract maximum meaning from minimal text. "Your Grace suggested formality, but not the complete coldness of previous interactions. I have read your letter confirmed that his confession had reached her, and presumably affected her in some way. I will keep today's roses was the most significant statement, and the one that made his hands continue their trembling. And this is not forgiveness, but it is acknowledgement was both disappointment and possibility wound together in a single sentence. Not forgiveness, he acknowledged to himself with ruthless honesty, but acknowledgement was more than he had dared hope for after 2 weeks of implacable refusal. Acknowledgement meant she had read his letter and had been moved enough by it to alter her position, however slightly. Acknowledgement meant the door he had slammed shut at Almack's and had been desperately trying to pry open ever since had finally shifted just the smallest increment on its hinges. It was enough. he told himself as he laid the note on his desk with the reverence one might accord a religious relic. It was more than enough because it meant possibility existed where before there had been only certainty of failure. And he immediately began planning tomorrow's roses with renewed purpose, his mind already racing ahead to what color and what message might best capitalize on this fragile opening. James felt something he had not felt since before Caroline's betrayal had shattered his ability to trust, something he had convinced himself he would never feel again, and had built his entire adult life around avoiding. He felt hope, real and terrifying and utterly beyond his control. It was not the cautious optimism of a man making a calculated investment, but the vulnerable hope of someone who has dared to care about an outcome he cannot guarantee, and the sensation was both exhilarating and frightening in equal measure. He recognized that Eleanor Hartley was a woman of principle who would not be easily won, that her decision to keep the roses after 15 days of refusal suggested genuine consideration rather than simple capitulation to pressure or spectacle, and oddly, he found he respected her even more for making him work for it, for refusing to soften until she was ready rather than simply accepting his apology because society expected it. His feelings, which had been focused primarily on guilt and the desperate need to make amends, began shifting toward something more complex and more dangerous, genuine affection for a woman he barely knew, but whose strength of character had revealed itself so clearly in her refusals. The study around him glowed with late-afternoon spring light, golden and warm as it streamed through tall windows, and the note lay on his desk like a treasure more valuable than all the contents of his various estates combined. He picked it up repeatedly over the next hour, as if it might vanish if he did not periodically confirm its physical reality, reading those few lines until he had memorized not just the words, but the exact formation of her letters, the places where her pen had pressed harder into the paper, the signature that was just her initials like his had been. Lord Peter Bancroft arrived without announcement, as had become his habit during the Rose campaign, and he found James standing at the window with a smile on his face that Bancroft had not seen in at least 3 years, possibly longer, the kind of unguarded expression of joy that the Duke rarely allowed himself. "Good news, I take it?" Bancroft said, as he helped himself to brandy from the sideboard, "for you are grinning like a fool, and I have not seen you grin at all in recent memory." "She kept the roses, Peter," James replied, without turning from the window, his voice full of wonder as though he were announcing a miracle. "She kept them. After 15,000 roses delivered and returned, she finally kept them. She sent me a note." Bancroft raised his glass in salute. "After 15,000, I should hope so," he observed with characteristic dry humor. "A man could go bankrupt sending roses at that rate, even with your considerable fortune. So what happens now, James? Surely you have some plan beyond continuing to send flowers indefinitely." "Now I continue," James said with renewed determination. "Every day I send roses. Every day I demonstrate that my commitment has not wavered. Every day until she agrees to see me in person." Bancroft studied his friend with an expression that mixed amusement and genuine concern. "And if she does agree," he asked quietly, "if she grants you an audience, what will you say to her? How will you prove yourself worthy of the chance she is giving you?" James turned from the window to face his oldest friend, and his expression shifted from joy to something more serious and more vulnerable. "Then I must find the words to explain what I could not explain at Almack's," he said slowly. "I must show her that the man who sent 15,000 roses is the real James Rothwell, and the man who rejected her publicly was a coward acting from fear. I must prove myself worthy of her consideration, and pray that consideration might eventually transform into something more." With the 20,000 roses came something entirely new, and Eleanor discovered it when she descended to the entrance hall to find servants examining the blooms with puzzled expressions, turning stems this way and that as though searching for something unexpected. Each rose bore a tiny tag attached with delicate ribbon, and on each tag was written a single word in handwriting that Eleanor now recognized as intimately as her own, the Duke's bold script rendered small and careful on hundreds upon hundreds of paper rectangles. Eleanor and Beatrice spent the morning collecting tags with growing excitement, working alongside servants who had become thoroughly invested in the unfolding love story and who offered their own tags with encouraging smiles. And gradually, as they gathered and arranged the words, a message began to emerge from what had initially seemed like chaos. "I see your strength," the message began, and Eleanor felt her breath catch because this was not the flowery language of conventional courtship, but something more direct and more personal. "I admire your conviction," the next section continued, and Eleanor thought of her 15 days of refusal, of her determination not to be bought or bullied into forgiveness, and she understood that he was praising the very stubbornness that had kept him at bay. "I regret my cowardice" came next, that word again that had struck her so forcefully in his letter, the admission that so few proud men would make, and Eleanor found herself moved by the repetition, by his willingness to claim that particular failing without excuse or mitigation. "I hope for your forgiveness" carried a vulnerability that made her chest tight, for hope was such a fragile thing to confess. Hope could be crushed and disappointed in ways that certainty could not. "I wait for your word" positioned her as the one with agency, the one whose decision mattered. And Eleanor recognized the deliberate reversal of power from Almack's, where he had held all control and she had been rendered helpless. "I will prove my sincerity" was both promise and plea, an acknowledgement that words and even flowers were insufficient without sustained demonstration of changed character. "I am yours to command," concluded the message, and those 4 words echoed in Eleanor's mind with implications she was not yet ready to fully examine, for they suggested not just apology, but something deeper, some shift in how he saw her, or perhaps in how he saw himself in relation to her. The personal effort required for this gesture struck Eleanor with particular force, for the Duke had written 1,000 tags by hand, had spent hours carefully forming words on tiny papers, had devoted time and attention that could not be delegated to servants or purchased with money, and that personal investment moved her in ways that mere extravagance could not. The message was not flowery or excessively romantic in the style that society expected. It did not compare her to roses or declare undying devotion. Instead, it was sincere and direct, and somehow that directness penetrated her remaining defenses more effectively than poetry would have done. She found herself softening further, the walls she had so carefully maintained beginning to crumble, not through assault, but through patient erosion, and the word "yours" echoed in her mind long after they had finished collecting all the tags and arranging them in proper order. The entrance hall and dining room and morning room were all filled with tagged roses, every surface covered with blooms that transformed the house into something magical, and servants moved among them with evident pleasure, helping to collect tags and contributing to the treasure hunt that the morning had become. Sunlight streamed through windows, illuminating petals and paper tags alike, and the house smelled like a garden in full bloom, overwhelming and beautiful, and somehow exactly right for this moment. It had become playful and tender in a way that surprised Eleanor, this collection of words on tiny papers feeling more like a game than a grand gesture. And she realized that the Duke was showing her a side of himself she had not witnessed at the formal gatherings where they had previously met. Beatrice read the complete message aloud once all the tags had been collected and arranged, her voice growing more excited with each phrase. And when she reached the conclusion, she turned to Eleanor with eyes bright with romantic certainty. "I am yours to command," she repeated with emphasis. "Eleanor, that is practically a declaration. Surely you see what this means." Eleanor felt heat rising to her cheeks and tried to maintain the composure that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. "It is an apology, nothing more," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "An elaborate apology, certainly, but still fundamentally an expression of regret for past behavior." Beatrice laughed with the kind of affectionate exasperation that only siblings can muster. "An apology that includes the words, 'I am yours,'" she challenged. "Sister, he is in love with you. Surely even you, with your determination to see only practical explanations for everything, must recognize that a man does not write 1,000 tags by hand unless his feelings go beyond simple guilt." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to insist that Beatrice was reading romance into what was merely thorough penance. But the words would not come because some part of her recognized the truth in her sister's observation. "Don't be absurd," she finally managed, but her blush betrayed her, spreading across her cheeks and down her neck in a way that made denial pointless. And Beatrice smiled with the satisfaction of someone who has won an argument without needing to press the point further. That evening, Eleanor sat at her writing desk with blank paper before her and a decision pressing against her chest like a physical weight. And after an hour of staring at the empty page, she finally took up her pen and began to write with a hand that trembled enough to make her first attempts illegible. "Your Grace," she wrote, and then paused, considering and reconsidering every word that would follow, for this letter felt momentous in a way that even keeping the roses had not. This was an active invitation rather than a passive acceptance. This was Eleanor taking control of the narrative that had been written about her for 20 days. "I will receive you tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the drawing-room at Hartley House," she continued, her pen moving more quickly now that she had committed to the course. "My mother will be present as chaperone as propriety demands. I make no promises beyond this meeting, but I believe we should speak frankly about what occurred at Almack's, and what, if anything, may come of your persistent apologies." She signed it formally. "Lady Eleanor Hartley," rather than with just initials, maintaining some distance even as she extended this olive branch. And then she sat back and stared at what she had written as though the words might rearrange themselves into something else if she looked away. Writing the letter felt momentous because Eleanor understood that she was crossing a threshold from which there would be no easy return, that agreeing to see the Duke face to face after 20 days of refusing him represented a fundamental shift in their dynamic, and she was taking control by inviting him on her terms, in her home, with her mother present, at an hour of her choosing. Fear and excitement mingled in her chest in approximately equal measure. Fear of what she might discover about him or about herself in this meeting. Excitement at the prospect of finally understanding the man behind the roses and the letter and the 1,000 tiny tags. She had kept 20,000 roses at this point, had allowed them to fill her home with their fragrance and beauty, and she could no longer pretend even to herself that indifference was what she felt, though she was also not ready to simply forgive and forget, to absolve him of the cruel humiliation at Almack's without demanding some accountability, some explanation that went beyond even his detailed letter. The letter sat on her desk waiting to be sealed and sent, cream paper covered in her slanting handwriting, and Eleanor found herself reluctant to complete the action that would set tomorrow's meeting into inevitable motion. Through her window she could see lights across London, thousands of windows illuminated against the spring darkness, and she wondered how many other people were at this moment making decisions that would alter the course of their lives in ways large or small. "Tomorrow will change everything," she thought with certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic. "Tomorrow I will sit across from James Rothwell and we will speak honestly for perhaps the first time since we met, And whatever happens in that conversation will determine whether these 20 days of roses have been prelude to something real or merely an extended apology that leads nowhere. She felt it in her bones, that sense of impending transformation, the way one feels a storm approaching before the first drops of rain fall. Eleanor stood and moved to her window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass and closing her eyes, trying to still the racing of her thoughts and the hammering of her heart. "Am I being foolish?" she asked aloud to her empty room. "Or brave? Is there even a difference between the two when matters of the heart are concerned?" She thought of her father's question from days earlier, the one that had unsettled her so thoroughly. "Do you want forgiveness or punishment?" And she realized that she still did not have a complete answer, but that the question itself had shifted. "Perhaps I want understanding," she whispered to the darkness beyond her window. "Perhaps I want to know who James Rothwell truly is beneath the Duke of Ashford. Perhaps I want to know if what I feel, this pull toward him despite everything he did, is madness or possibility or some combination of both." She thought of his letter with its confession of past betrayal and present fear. She thought of the 1,000 tags written in his own hand declaring, "I am yours to command." She thought of 20 days of persistence that suggested either obsession or genuine feeling, and she could not yet determine which. The letter on her desk seemed to pulse with significance, and finally Eleanor returned to her seat, took up her sealing wax, and completed the action that would summon the Duke to Hartley House tomorrow afternoon. As she pressed her seal into the warm red wax, she felt simultaneously like she was opening a door and like she was stepping through one, leaving behind the certainty of her anger for the uncertain territory of whatever came next. She rang for a footman and gave instructions for the letter to be delivered immediately to the Duke's residence in Grosvenor Square, and as the servant departed with the sealed note, Eleanor felt her hands begin to tremble in earnest, for she had just invited the man who had publicly humiliated her to call upon her privately, and she could not predict whether this decision would prove to be the wisest or the most foolish thing she had ever done. The Duke of Ashford arrived at precisely 3 o'clock, and Eleanor knew this because she had been watching the mantel clock with obsessive attention for the past hour. Her nerves wound so tight that she jumped at every sound in the house, every footstep in the corridor, every distant door closing. When the knocker finally sounded, she took a deep breath and pressed her hands flat against her skirts to still their trembling, and she noticed immediately when he was shown into the drawing-room that he carried no roses, a deliberate choice that she appreciated more than she could have articulated, for it suggested he understood that this meeting required something other than grand gestures. He looked different than she remembered from Almack's, humbler somehow, more uncertain, as though the 21 days between that night and this afternoon had worn away some of the aristocratic polish that had made him seem so untouchable, and gone was the cold formality that had chilled her to the bone when he rejected her before all of society. Eleanor waited in the drawing-room with her mother seated beside her like a guardian, or perhaps a witness, and they sat formally as the Duke was announced and entered, and tension crackled in the air like static before a thunderstorm, so thick that Eleanor thought she might choke on it. He bowed to them both with perfect courtesy. "Your Grace, Lady Eleanor," and his voice was the same deep tone she remembered, but without the coldness, carrying instead a note of nervousness that made him seem more human and therefore somehow more dangerous to her careful defenses. They exchanged awkward pleasantries about the weather and the season and other meaningless topics that filled the air with words, but conveyed nothing of substance, and Eleanor felt her mother's presence like a weight beside her, both comforting and constraining, until finally her mother rose with obvious deliberation and announced that she would sit by the window with her needlework, present as propriety demanded, but far enough away to grant them privacy for serious conversation. The Hartley House drawing-room was elegant, but not ostentatious, decorated in shades of cream and gold that caught the afternoon sun slanting through tall windows, and Eleanor had chosen to wear a gown of pale blue that was simple and dignified without being severe, while the Duke wore a dark coat with no excessive finery, and together they looked like two people stripped of artifice, facing each other without the protective colouring of society's usual costumes. The roses he had sent over the past 3 weeks filled the adjoining room, their fragrance drifting into the drawing room as a constant reminder of his 21 days of penance, and Eleanor found their scent both comforting and unsettling, a physical presence that seemed to press upon the conversation they were about to have. Eleanor's heart raced in her chest as she looked at James Rothwell properly for the first time since that terrible night, really looked at him rather than seeing only the Duke who had wronged her, and she observed details she had not noticed before, the slight shadows beneath his eyes that suggested he had slept as poorly as she had, the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair as though he needed something to anchor him, the careful attention he paid to her every expression as though he were trying to read in her face whether he had any hope at all. James was equally nervous. She could see it in the tension of his shoulders and the tightness around his mouth, and she understood that he recognized this meeting as his only real chance, that all the roses in England could not help him if he failed to find the right words now. "Your Grace," Eleanor began, because someone had to break the silence and she had invited him here, so the responsibility was hers. "I agreed to see you because I read your letter. I understand now why you behaved as you did at Almack's, though I cannot say I approve of the method you chose." James leaned forward slightly, his green eyes intense and focused entirely on her face. "Nor should you approve, Lady Eleanor," he replied with immediate honesty. "Understanding my reasons does not make my actions less cruel, does not erase the pain I caused you. I would not insult you by suggesting otherwise." Eleanor felt something in her chest respond to his directness, to his refusal to make excuses, even when she had offered him the opening to do so. "No, it does not," she agreed, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "You humiliated me before all of society because you were afraid. Your fear of vulnerability led you to wound someone innocent, and I needed you to understand that pain, to feel some measure of what I felt, standing there as you rejected me without cause." "I do understand," James said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I swear to you I do. I have relived that moment every day since it happened. I have seen your face in my mind, the exact instant when hope transformed to confusion, to devastation. And the memory haunts me as it should." They sat in silence for a moment, the honesty between them creating a strange intimacy despite the physical distance maintained by their separate chairs. Eleanor gathered her courage for the question that had plagued her since the roses began. "The roses," she said. "Why so many? Why such excess when a simple apology delivered in person might have sufficed?" James took a breath as though preparing to dive into deep water. "Because excess was required to match the enormity of my wrong," he explained. "Because a simple apology could not convey the depth of my regret. Because I needed you and all of London to know that I would not give up, that I would persist until you believed my remorse was genuine." He hesitated, and Eleanor prompted him gently. "Because," she repeated, "there is more you are not saying." James met her eyes fully, and Eleanor saw in them something that made her breath catch. "Because somewhere in these weeks of sending roses and waiting for your word, I realized I was not just seeking forgiveness, Lady Eleanor. I was seeking you." Eleanor listened to the Duke's confession, that he had been seeking her rather than merely seeking forgiveness, and she felt the words settle into her chest with a weight that was both terrifying and thrilling. But she did not allow herself to be swept away by the romance of the declaration, for she had learned at Almack's what happened when one allowed hope to override caution. Instead, She drew upon the strength that 21 days of refusing roses had built within her, that core of steel that had emerged from humiliation and had been tempered by her determination not to be easily won. And she spoke with quiet firmness that surprised even herself. "If I am to consider truly forgiving you, Your Grace," she began, and paused deliberately to let the emphasis sink in. "And I stress the word consider, for I make no promises beyond consideration. Then I require more than roses and pretty words, however numerous or beautifully phrased they may be." James sat forward in his chair, his entire being focused on her words, as though his life depended on understanding exactly what she meant, and Eleanor found his attention both flattering and empowering, for this was so different from Almack's, where he had held all the power and she had been rendered helpless. "I require time to know you as you actually are," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she articulated needs she had not fully realized she had until this moment. "Not as the perfect duke of society who maintains appropriate distance and says appropriate things, and not as the guilty supplicant sending flowers to assuage his conscience, but as James Rothwell, the man who wrote that letter, the man who was betrayed and built walls to protect himself, the man who makes mistakes and acknowledges them." She leaned forward slightly, maintaining eye contact in a way that would have been considered too direct for a proper young lady, but which felt necessary for this conversation. "I want honesty, even when it is uncomfortable. I want to see your character revealed through sustained action rather than grand gestures. I want to understand who you are when society is not watching and roses cannot speak for you." Eleanor felt powerful in this moment of defining her own terms rather than accepting those imposed upon her, and she recognized that this power was something the Duke had inadvertently given her through his terrible mistake at Almack's, for his wrongdoing had placed him in a position where he could only receive what she chose to grant. The Duke listened with full attention that never wavered, nodding slowly as she spoke, and Eleanor could see him processing each requirement, weighing it, accepting it without argument or attempt at negotiation, and his willingness to hear her terms without defensiveness told her more about his sincerity than any number of roses could have conveyed. He realized, she could see it dawning in his expression, that she was giving him a genuine chance, not the easy capitulation that society expected, but a real opportunity to prove himself over time. And it was a chance he did not deserve, but one he clearly intended to fight to honor. Relief and determination settled over his features in equal measure, the relief of someone who had feared complete rejection, and the determination of someone who understands the magnitude of the task before him. The drawing room around them had transformed as afternoon light deepened toward evening, the sun lower now and casting longer shadows across the polished floors, and Eleanor's mother remained dutifully at her post by the window, though both Eleanor and James had effectively forgotten her presence. The two of them were locked in intense conversation that felt simultaneously like negotiation and like something far more intimate, a meeting of minds and wills that created its own atmosphere independent of their physical surroundings. The world had shrunk to just this room, this moment, this careful construction of terms under which they might move forward, and Eleanor felt as though they were building something together even as they discussed the destruction James had caused. "What would you have me do, Lady Eleanor?" James asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than defensiveness. "Tell me precisely what you require, and I will endeavor to provide it." Eleanor took a breath, steadying herself before articulating the path forward. "Call upon me properly," she said, "not with wagons of roses, but as a gentleman calls upon a lady he wishes to know better. Allow me to know your mind, your interests, your true character through conversation and shared activities. Court me as you should have from the beginning, with respect rather than spectacle, with consistency rather than grand gestures. She paused, and then added with careful emphasis, "I want to see who you are across weeks and months, not who you can pretend to be for an afternoon." James nodded slowly, his expression serious as he absorbed the implications of what she was asking. "And if I do this," he asked quietly, "if I prove myself worthy of your time and attention through sustained, honest courtship, might you one day feel for me what I am beginning to feel for you?" The question hung between them, vulnerable and hopeful and dangerous in its directness, and Eleanor felt her heart respond to it, even as her mind counseled caution. She chose her words carefully, wanting to be honest without making promises she could not be certain of keeping. "I cannot promise my heart, Your Grace," she said gently but firmly, "for hearts are not commodities to be exchanged based on meeting certain conditions. But I can promise my honest consideration. I can promise to approach this potential courtship with an open mind and without allowing what happened at Almack's to forever define my opinion of you." She met his eyes directly. "Is that enough?" she asked. "Is honest consideration without guaranteed outcome sufficient for you to proceed?" James's answer came without hesitation, his voice carrying conviction that needed no elaboration. "It is more than I deserve, Lady Eleanor," he said simply. "Yes, it is enough. It is more than enough because it means you are giving me a chance I have no right to expect, and I will not waste that chance, I swear to you." Over the following 2 weeks, the Duke of Ashford called upon Eleanor 3 times per week at proper hours, arriving punctually at 11 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon, as convention dictated, and the roses that had dominated their interaction for 21 days ceased entirely, replaced by something infinitely more valuable, which was his actual presence and attention. They walked in Hyde Park with Eleanor's maid trailing at a discreet distance, following the fashionable paths where all of London society promenaded to see and be seen, and Eleanor found that she enjoyed these walks immensely, despite the curious glances directed their way, for James proved to be an excellent conversationalist who treated her observations with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. They attended gallery exhibitions at the Royal Academy where they stood before paintings and debated the merits of various artistic movements, James revealing a knowledge of art history that surprised Eleanor and a willingness to defer to her interpretations that pleased her even more, and she discovered that disagreeing with him was not only permitted but actively encouraged, that he seemed to relish their intellectual sparring in a way that suggested he had been starved for substantive conversation. They sat in the Hartley drawing room on rainy afternoons when outdoor activities were impossible, and talked about everything under the sun. Books they had read and loved or hated, political questions that consumed Parliament, childhood memories both happy and sad, hopes for the future that they had never articulated to another soul, and these conversations revealed layers of personality that formal social interactions could never expose. No roses arrived during these 2 weeks, a deliberate choice that Eleanor appreciated for it, demonstrated that James understood the difference between courtship and spectacle, but he did bring thoughtful small gifts that showed he listened carefully to everything she said, a volume of Wordsworth's poetry she had mentioned wanting to read, a delicate watercolor sketch of Hartley Manor that he had commissioned from an artist of his acquaintance, a rare edition of a botanical text she had admired in a shop window during one of their walks. Eleanor found herself genuinely enjoying his company in a way that both delighted and unsettled her, for she had expected to tolerate his courtship as a necessary penance he must pay. But instead she discovered that the man behind the title was intelligent and surprisingly funny, possessed of a dry wit that caught her off guard and made her laugh with genuine amusement rather than polite acknowledgement. James carried his wounds with dignity, never using his past betrayal as excuse for present behavior, but acknowledging how it had shaped him, and Eleanor respected this honest self-awareness that so many people lacked. James, for his part, discovered that Eleanor Hartley was even more remarkable than he had imagined during those brief interactions before Almack's. She was sharp-witted and could match him point for point in any debate. She was compassionate in her concern for those less fortunate. She held strong opinions about everything from literature to social reform and was not afraid to voice them even when they contradicted his own views. And this strength of character that had been so evident in her refusals now manifested as intellectual vitality that captivated him completely. They laughed together over shared observations about society's absurdities. They debated the merits of various parliamentary reforms, with passion but without rancor. They discovered shared interests in unexpected places and learned to navigate their differences with respect. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, they began to trust each other with the kind of small vulnerabilities that precede deeper intimacy. The locations of their courtship were ordinary. The well-worn paths of Hyde Park, now in full spring bloom, with chestnuts leafing out and early roses beginning to flower. The quiet galleries of the British Museum, where ancient marbles observed their modern romance with stone indifference. The crowded aisles of Hatchard's bookshop, where they browsed together and recommended volumes to each other. The refined atmosphere of Gunther's tea shop, where they sat at a small table and shared ices while conversation flowed as easily as if they had known each other for years. These normal courting places took on a magical quality through the alchemy of genuine connection, and Eleanor found that she looked forward to each appointment with anticipation that felt dangerously close to joy. London itself seemed to watch their progress with approval, the scandal that had begun at Almack's transforming into romance as society observed the Duke's sustained and proper courtship of Lady Eleanor, and the whispers that had been cruel now turned admiring, noting how devoted he appeared, how she had handled the entire situation with remarkable dignity, how they seemed genuinely well-suited despite the inauspicious beginning. During a walk in Hyde Park on a particularly beautiful May afternoon, when the sun was warm and the breeze gentle, Eleanor gathered her courage to ask a question that had been forming in her mind. "What do you fear most?" she asked as they paused beside the Serpentine to watch swans gliding across the water. "Not what did you fear in the past, but what frightens you now?" James considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all her inquiries, his expression thoughtful as he gazed across the water. "Becoming the man I was at Almack's," he said finally, "so controlled that I become cruel, so focused on protecting myself that I wound others. I fear that my capacity for coldness might reassert itself in moments of stress or uncertainty." He turned to look at her directly. "And you, Eleanor? What do you fear most?" Eleanor had known he would return the question, and had prepared her answer, though speaking it aloud still required courage. "That I will give my heart and be made a fool again," she admitted quietly. "That I will trust and be betrayed. That hope will once again prove to be dangerous rather than joyful." James stopped walking, turning to face her fully with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I cannot promise never to make mistakes, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I am human and flawed, and I will undoubtedly disappoint you in small ways as all people disappoint those they care for. But I can promise never to deliberately wound you again, never to use cruelty as a shield for my own fear. Your heart would be safe with me. I swear it." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some final barrier beginning to crumble, and she met his eyes with honesty that matched his own. "I am beginning to believe that," she whispered, and the admission felt like both victory and surrender. 3 weeks after their first meeting in the Hartley drawing room, James called upon Eleanor on an afternoon that felt no different from the dozen other afternoons they had spent together, except that when he arrived, Eleanor felt her heart skip in a way that suggested something significant was approaching, even if she could not name what it might be. They sat in the drawing room with Eleanor's mother present as always, discussing a book they had both recently read, their conversation flowing with the ease that had developed over weeks of steady acquaintance, when Eleanor's mother suddenly rose and announced that she needed to consult with the housekeeper about arrangements for an upcoming dinner party. She departed with a knowing glance at Eleanor that suggested her exit was not entirely motivated by domestic concerns, and the drawing-room door remained properly ajar as propriety demanded. But for the first time since their courtship began, Eleanor and James found themselves essentially alone. The hallway beyond empty, and the distant sounds of household activity providing no real supervision. The silence that fell after Lady Hartley's departure was different from their usual comfortable pauses, charged with possibility and anticipation, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as James stood and crossed the small distance between his chair and hers, kneeling beside her seat so that their eyes were level. He took her hand in his, the touch sending warmth through her arm despite the barrier of their gloves, and his expression was more vulnerable than she had ever seen it, as though he were about to risk everything on a single throw of dice. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice carrying intensity that made the simple name sound like poetry, "I can no longer pretend that my feelings are anything but love. I have tried to approach our courtship with appropriate restraint, to give you time and space to come to your own conclusions. But I find I cannot wait another moment without telling you that I am utterly and completely in love with you." Eleanor felt her heart soar at the declaration. The words she had not allowed herself to hope for, now spoken aloud in the golden afternoon light, and she found her own voice trembling as she replied, "I feel the same, James," she admitted, the use of his Christian name feeling intimate and right. "I have tried to be cautious, to protect myself from the possibility of being hurt again. But somewhere in these weeks of conversation and laughter and shared silences, I fell in love with you despite my best efforts at self-preservation." James's face transformed with joy so pure it made him look years younger, and he raised her gloved hand to his lips in a gesture that was both formal and deeply tender. "May I kiss you?" he whispered, asking permission rather than simply taking what he wanted. And that request for consent after everything that had passed between them moved Eleanor almost as much as his declaration of love. "Yes," she breathed, the single word carrying months of longing and fear and hope. And then his lips were on hers, and the world fell away until nothing existed except this moment, this connection, this rightness. Their first kiss was tender and tentative at first, as though both were afraid of breaking the spell. But as Eleanor responded, the kiss deepened, becoming more certain, more passionate, an expression of feelings too profound for words alone to carry. James pulled her close with reverence, as though she were something precious and fragile that must be handled with utmost care, and Eleanor felt his arms around her, and knew with absolute certainty that she was safe here, that her heart was safe with this man who had once wounded her so terribly, but who had proven through patience and persistence that he was worthy of her trust. When they finally parted, both were breathless, James's forehead resting against hers as they remained close enough that Eleanor could feel his breath on her face, and the fear that had haunted them both, his fear of vulnerability and her fear of betrayal, dissolved in this moment of complete connection and mutual surrender. The drawing room around them glowed with late afternoon light, golden and warm as it slanted through tall windows, and the door remained open, but the hallway beyond was still empty, as though the entire household had conspired to give them this moment of privacy. Time seemed to have stopped, the distant sounds of London traffic and household activity fading to nothing, and everything narrowed to the two of them, the taste of tea still on his lips from the cup he had drunk before her mother departed, the scent of Eleanor's lavender perfume that she always wore, the absolute rightness of being held by him and holding him in return. Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they were tears of happiness rather than pain. Tears that acknowledged the journey they had taken from Almack's to this moment, and she knew with certainty that she had forgiven him completely. That whatever hurt remained from that terrible night had been healed by these weeks of honest courtship and genuine connection. "I never thought I could feel this way about you," she whispered when she could finally speak. "After Almack's, I thought hate was all I could manage. I thought the wound was too deep to ever transform into anything but permanent scar tissue." James pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. "And now," he asked, his voice rough with emotion, "what do you feel now, Eleanor?" She smiled through her tears, a radiant expression that felt like sunrise after long darkness. "Now I love you," she said simply, quite desperately actually. "I love you. James Rothwell, with all the passion I once devoted to refusing you, and I find that loving you is infinitely preferable to hating you, though it is perhaps equally consuming." James laughed softly, the sound carrying relief and joy in equal measure, and kissed her again, this time with less hesitation and more certainty, a kiss that promised a future neither of them had dared imagine when roses first began arriving at Hartley House 43 days ago. They heard footsteps in the hall, signaling the return of Eleanor's mother, or perhaps a servant, and they separated reluctantly, returning to their proper positions with flushed cheeks and bright eyes that would surely give them away. But neither could bring themselves to regret the stolen moment or the declarations that had transformed their careful courtship into acknowledged love at so. Just as Eleanor and James's courtship had become public knowledge and London society had settled into acceptance of their unlikely romance, viewing it as proof that even the worst scandals could transform into happily ever after, a complication arose that threatened to upend everything they had so carefully built over the past month. Lady Caroline Ashworth returned to London from the continent where she had been living since her engagement to James had ended in spectacular failure 3 years prior, and her arrival created ripples through society that quickly became waves threatening to swamp Eleanor's hard-won happiness. Caroline began making appearances at social events with the kind of calculated casualness that suggested deliberate strategy rather than coincidence. And Eleanor saw her for the first time at Lady Pemberton's evening musical, a vision of classical beauty with golden hair and porcelain skin moving through the crowded drawing room with the effortless charm that came from absolute confidence in one's own appeal. The gossip columns seized upon Caroline's return, with the gleeful enthusiasm they always brought to potential scandal, speculating wildly about her motivations and whether the former lovers might reconcile now that Caroline had supposedly matured during her time abroad, and the Duke had proved himself capable of romantic gesture through his pursuit of Lady Eleanor. Eleanor tried desperately not to feel threatened by Caroline's presence, reminding herself that James had chosen her, that he had sent 43,000 roses and courted her properly for weeks, that he had declared his love and kissed her with passion that could not be feigned, but insecurity crept in like fog through cracks in her confidence. Caroline was everything Eleanor was not, classically beautiful where Eleanor was merely pleasant-looking, effortlessly charming where Eleanor had to work at social grace, connected to James's past in ways that Eleanor could never be, and the comparison felt invidious and impossible to win. She watched from across Lady Pemberton's drawing room as Caroline laughed at something a gentleman said, her hand touching his arm with practiced flirtation. And Eleanor wondered whether James had once been the recipient of such touches, whether he compared Eleanor's more reserved manner to Caroline's vivacious appeal and found Eleanor wanting. James was frustrated and angry when he learned of Caroline's return, his jaw tightening and his eyes going cold in a way Eleanor had not seen since their early conversations. and he reassured Eleanor repeatedly that Caroline meant nothing to him, that whatever he had felt 3 years ago had died completely when he discovered her betrayal, that Eleanor had no reason for jealousy or concern. But his very vehemence suggested that Caroline's presence affected him more than he wanted to admit, and Eleanor's old fears resurfaced with renewed strength, the fear of being made a fool, of giving her heart only to discover it had been a mistake, of hope proving once again to be dangerous rather than joyful. London drawing rooms buzzed with renewed gossip. The conversations Eleanor overheard at every social gathering filled with speculation about the triangle that society perceived between the Duke, his former fiancé, and his current attachment, and some voices suggested with poorly concealed delight that perhaps James's pursuit of Eleanor had been merely a distraction from his true feelings for Caroline. The brief peace of their courtship felt disrupted, as though they had been walking through a beautiful garden only to discover serpents hiding in the roses, and spring was turning to early summer with the season reaching its height, the social calendar packed with events that Eleanor could not avoid, without confirming society's suspicion that she was worried about Caroline's return. Everywhere Eleanor went, she heard Caroline's name, spoken with admiration by gentlemen and with envy by ladies, and the joy of recent weeks felt suddenly fragile, as though it were built on sand rather than stone, and the first strong wave might wash it away entirely. Beatrice found Eleanor in the library one afternoon when she had pleaded a headache to avoid yet another social engagement where she would be forced to smile while society dissected her romantic prospects, and her sister's face carried the expression of someone bearing unwelcome news. "They are saying Lady Caroline never stopped loving him," Beatrice reported with reluctance, "that she went to the continent to give him space, but always intended to return, that she wants him back and believes she can win him." Eleanor tried to sound unconcerned, though her hands trembled as she set down the book she had been pretending to read. "The Duke has made his choice clear," she said with more confidence than she felt. "He has been courting me properly for weeks. Surely that demonstrates where his affections lie." Beatrice sat beside her sister and took her hand with gentle sympathy. "But has he—" "Eleanor?" she asked quietly. "I do not mean to distress you, but he has not formally proposed to you. Has he? He has declared his love." "Yes, but until there is an actual engagement, everything remains uncertain, and Caroline is very beautiful and very determined." Eleanor felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the weight of fears she had been trying to ignore. The doubt that Beatrice voiced was the same doubt that had been growing in Eleanor's own mind, for James had not proposed, despite their declarations of love, had not asked her father for permission to court her formally, with intent to marry, and without that concrete commitment, Eleanor found herself wondering whether his feelings were as deep as her own, or whether she was once again allowing hope to blind her to reality. At Lady Pemberton's ball 3 nights after Caroline's return to London, Eleanor stood near the refreshment table watching dancers swirl across the polished floor when Caroline herself approached with a smile that was sweet as honey, but carried beneath it something that made Eleanor's skin prickle with instinctive warning. "Lady Eleanor," Caroline said warmly, as though they were old friends rather than rivals for the same man's affection. "How lovely to finally meet you properly. I have heard so much about you and your remarkable romance with dear James." Eleanor managed a polite smile, though her heart had begun to pound with apprehension. "Lady Caroline," she replied with careful courtesy, "I trust you are enjoying your return to London." Caroline's laugh was light and musical, the kind of laugh that drew male attention from across the room. "Oh, immensely," she said, "though I confess I find much has changed during my absence. Shall we step onto the terrace for a moment? I would so enjoy a private word with you." Eleanor wanted to refuse, but could think of no polite way to decline without appearing afraid, so she followed Caroline through the French doors onto the terrace where the June night air was warm and heavy with the scent of roses from the garden below. They stood at the balustrade overlooking the darkened garden, and Caroline's expression shifted subtly, the sweet smile taking on an edge that Eleanor had suspected was always there beneath the surface charm. "You do know he settled for you, do you not, dear?" Caroline said conversationally, as though discussing the weather rather than delivering calculated cruelty. "After I broke his heart, James wanted someone safe, someone who would not challenge him or demand too much, someone who would be grateful for his attention rather than expecting it as her due." Eleanor felt the words strike like physical blows but forced herself to remain composed. "The Duke makes his own choices," she replied, though her voice came out less steady than she intended. "He pursued me quite deliberately and has made his feelings clear." Caroline turned to face her directly, and in the moonlight her beautiful face looked almost predatory. "Does he, though?" she asked with false sympathy. "Or does he simply follow the path of least resistance? You must understand, Eleanor, that James and I share a history that cannot be erased by a few weeks of courtship. However public and romantic it may have appeared, we were engaged to be married. We were intimate in ways that go beyond mere conversation and walks in the park." Eleanor felt heat rising to her cheeks at the implication. Whether true or false she could not determine, but the suggestion that James and Caroline had shared intimacies that Eleanor had not planted seeds of doubt that found fertile ground in her existing insecurities. "He has been calling at my residence, you know," Caroline continued, as though sharing a confidence between friends. "Just yesterday, in fact, we spoke for nearly 2 hours about old times and future possibilities. Old habits die hard. Eleanor and first loves have a power that later attachments simply cannot match." The lie was delivered with such casual confidence that Eleanor had no reason to doubt it, and she felt her carefully rebuilt confidence beginning to crumble like sand castles before an incoming tide. Caroline leaned closer and lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I do not wish to be cruel, dear, but someone should tell you the truth. James only pursued you out of guilt after that terrible business at Almack's. His feelings are not genuine affection, but rather pity mixed with obligation. He felt he had wronged you, and so he performed this elaborate courtship to assuage his conscience. But do you truly believe a man like the Duke of Ashford could love someone so ordinary when he has known someone like me?" Eleanor felt something breaking inside her chest, all her old fears surging back with renewed force, the fear that she was second choice, that the roses had been manipulation rather than genuine feeling, that James's love was pity rather than passion, and Caroline's words preyed on her deepest insecurities with surgical precision. She wanted to argue, to defend James and herself, but the doubts Caroline had planted grew with terrifying speed, choking out the certainty that had been growing over weeks of courtship. When James finally arrived at the ball an hour later, having been delayed by business matters that could not wait, he searched the ballroom for Eleanor and found her standing rigidly near the windows, her expression closed in a way he had not seen since their earliest interactions. He approached with a smile that faded when he saw her face, and when he took her hand she allowed it but without warmth, as though she were merely tolerating his touch rather than welcoming it. "What is wrong?" he asked with concern. That sounded genuine to Eleanor's ears, but which she now questioned. "You seem distant, Eleanor. Has something happened? Perhaps I am simply seeing clearly for the first time," she replied, her voice cool in a way designed to wound, seeing situations as they actually are rather than as I wished them to be. The elegant ballroom that had seemed magical when Eleanor entered now felt hostile. The music that played sounded discordant rather than beautiful. The beautiful people moving around them seemed like predators circling wounded prey, and the golden glow of hundreds of candles felt like spotlight illuminating her inadequacy for all to see. James stood across from her, confused and hurt by the sudden change, searching her face for explanation of what had shifted so dramatically in the hours since he had last seen her, and Eleanor watched him, and wondered whether Caroline had been telling the truth, whether she had been a fool all along to believe that someone like the Duke of Ashford could truly love someone like her, whether hope had once again proved to be her greatest enemy. The misunderstanding between Eleanor and James escalated with terrible speed, fed by Caroline's poison and Eleanor's resurrected fears. And within days, what had been a courtship full of promise had deteriorated into cold formality and painful silence. Eleanor told James during his next call at Hartley House that she needed time to think, to be certain of her feelings and his, to understand whether what they had built was real or merely an elaborate construction of guilt and obligation on his part and desperate hope on hers. James listened to her request with an expression that shifted from confusion to hurt, to something harder and more closed, and when he replied, his voice carried the cold formality she had not heard since their very first conversations after Almack's. "If you require time, then of course I shall grant it, Lady Eleanor," he said, using her title rather than her name, in a way that felt like distance being deliberately inserted between them. "I would not wish to press my suit where it is not wanted, or where my sincerity is perpetually in question." They parted badly with words that both would later regret, but which neither could take back once spoken. Eleanor suggesting that perhaps they had moved too quickly from animosity to affection. James replying that perhaps she was right, and that time apart would clarify whether their feelings were genuine or merely the result of an unusual situation, and the door of Hartley House closed between them with a finality that felt ominous. Eleanor returned to her bedroom and allowed the tears she had been holding back to finally fall, crying with the kind of abandoned grief that comes from feeling one has ruined everything through one's own weakness and inability to trust. She knew even as she wept that she was overreacting, that Caroline's words should not have had such power over her, that James had given her no actual reason to doubt his feelings, but the old wound from Almack's had reopened, and all the pain she thought she had processed came flooding back with renewed intensity. James returned to his townhouse and went directly to his study, where he poured himself brandy and then another and then a third, drinking more than was wise but unable to stop himself from seeking some numbness against the pain of Eleanor's doubt. He sat in the dark with only the dying embers of the fire for light and wondered with bitter frustration how Caroline still had the power to destroy his happiness 3 years after her betrayal, how her mere presence in London had been enough to undo weeks of careful courtship and genuine connection. Both were miserable in their separate spaces of loneliness. Eleanor in her bedroom that felt dark and cold despite the warmth of the summer night, as though the chill came from inside her rather than from any external source, and James in his study where the fire had gone out completely, and dawn light began creeping through the windows as he sat awake all night wrestling with anger and despair. The roses that had once filled Hartley House with colour and fragrance were wilting now, their petals dropping and their stems drooping in their vases, and Eleanor saw in their decline a metaphor for the relationship's sudden deterioration, as though everything beautiful they had created was subject to the same inevitable decay. Beatrice found Eleanor the morning after the confrontation, red-eyed and pale, sitting at her window staring out at nothing, and her sister sat beside her with the kind of gentle concern that made Eleanor want to weep again. "What if Caroline is right?" Eleanor whispered, the question that had tormented her all night finally given voice. "What if I am just the safe choice? The woman he settled for because I would be grateful and undemanding? What if his feelings are pity rather than love, and I have been too foolish to see it?" Beatrice took her sister's hands and squeezed them firmly. "Then why did he send 21,000 roses, Eleanor?" she asked with the logical clarity that Eleanor's emotional turmoil had obscured. "Why did he write that letter laying bare his deepest wounds? Why did he court you properly for weeks when he could have simply moved on to some other attachment? Safe men do not do those things. Desperate men in love do those things. But Eleanor could not hear the logic through the noise of her fears, and she merely shook her head and returned to staring out the window as though answers might appear in the London streets below. Meanwhile, across the city in his study, James received Lord Bancroft, who had arrived at an unseemly early hour, having heard through the servant network that something had gone terribly wrong, and he found his friend unshaven and dishevelled in a way that suggested he had not slept or changed clothes since the previous evening. "I have done everything I can, Peter," James said without preamble, his voice rough from drink and exhaustion. "I have proven myself repeatedly. I have courted her properly. I have declared my love. What more does she need from me? How can I fight ghosts and insecurities that exist only in her mind?" As Bancroft studied his friend with sympathy, but also with the brutal honesty that long friendship permitted. "Perhaps just your complete honesty about Caroline," he suggested quietly. "Have you told Eleanor exactly what happened 3 years ago? The full truth of the betrayal and how you discovered it? Have you explained why Caroline's return affects you so deeply?" James looked up sharply, his expression shifting from despair to something more complicated. "I told her I was engaged and that it ended badly," he said slowly. "I wrote in my letter about discovering Caroline's betrayal, but I did not provide details, I thought." "You thought the past was past and did not need to be excavated," Bancroft finished. "But the past is never truly past, James, especially when it walks back into London and starts spreading poison. Eleanor needs to understand not just that Caroline betrayed you, but how and why. She needs to see the full picture to understand why Caroline's words have no validity." James dropped his head into his hands and acknowledged the truth of his friend's observation, and he recognized that, in trying to protect Eleanor from the sordid details of his past, he had instead left her vulnerable to Caroline's manipulation. 2 days after the confrontation that had left both Eleanor and James miserable and separated, the Duke of Ashford attended the opera at the King's Theatre with determination hardening in his chest, for he had learned through careful inquiry that both Caroline and Eleanor would be present, and he had resolved that this farce of misunderstanding would end tonight, regardless of the scandal it might create. During the first intermission, when London's elite emerged from their boxes to promenade and gossip in the grand corridors, James saw Caroline holding court in her box surrounded by admirers, and he crossed the theatre with purposeful strides that made people step aside, his expression forbidding enough that no one dared interrupt his progress. He stopped directly before Caroline's box and spoke in a voice pitched to carry to the nearby boxes that held some of London's most influential gossips, ensuring that his words would be witnessed and repeated throughout the city by morning. "Lady Caroline," he began without preamble or polite greeting, "I understand you have been spreading falsehoods about visiting between us, about private calls and renewed affection, and I believe it is time to clarify matters before witnesses so there can be no further confusion or deliberate misrepresentation." The opera house around them began to hush as people recognized that something extraordinary was happening, conversations dying mid-sentence as attention focused on the Duke and his former fiancée, and Caroline's smile froze on her face as she realized what was about to occur. "Let me state clearly before all these witnesses," James continued with cold precision, "I have not called upon you since your return to London. I have no intention of calling upon you now or at any future date, and your presence in this city changes absolutely nothing regarding my feelings for Lady Eleanor Hartley, whom I intend to marry if she will have me." The horseshoe of boxes rising up around the opera house was filled with London's elite, and every single person seemed to be holding their breath. The gas lights burned bright, illuminating the red velvet and gilt that made the space feel like a stage, designed for precisely this kind of real-life drama, and all eyes fixed on James and Caroline before swiveling to locate Eleanor's box across the theatre. James felt liberated by the public declaration, freed from the careful social maneuvering that had constrained him for years, for he was done hiding his feelings behind propriety, and done allowing his past to control his future, and he recognized that sometimes the only way to combat lies was with truth spoken so loudly and publicly that it could not be twisted or reinterpreted. Caroline's face flushed with humiliation and fury, her beautiful features contorting in a way that revealed the ugliness beneath. "How dare you embarrass me publicly?" she hissed, though her words carried less force than she intended, because everyone could see that she was the one who had been caught in falsehood. "You are making a spectacle of yourself over that plain nobody, when you could have me, when we could recapture what we once had." James leaned forward slightly, and his voice, when he replied, was hard as granite. "I dare because you lied about me to hurt an innocent woman, Lady Caroline. I dare because you have already caused enough damage in my life, and I will not permit you to cause more. You forfeited any consideration from me when you betrayed me with my own brother 3 years ago, and I have finally stopped letting that betrayal control my life or my choices." The revelation of Caroline's betrayal with James's brother sent a new wave of gasps through the assembled crowd, for many had known the engagement ended, but few knew the specific circumstances, and Caroline looked as though she might faint or rage, her hands gripping the edge of her box as though she needed physical support. James turned away from her dismissively, his attention moving across the theatre to where Eleanor sat in her family's box, and he could see even at this distance that her face was pale and her eyes wide as she absorbed everything that had just occurred. "Lady Eleanor!" he called across the space separating them, his voice still carrying to every corner of the opera house. "Would you do me the honor of joining me?" The request was unprecedented. Calling a lady from her box to join a gentleman in the public space of the theatre. But James was beyond caring about convention, and his eyes held Eleanor's across the distance, asking a question that went far deeper than the simple words suggested. The entire opera house waited in breathless anticipation to see what Eleanor would do, whether she would acknowledge him, or whether she would turn away and confirm that their relationship had ended. And in her box, Eleanor felt her heart leaping in her chest as she understood what James was offering her: public declaration, public commitment, public reversal of everything that had happened at Almack's 6 weeks ago. She had heard every word he spoke, had seen him defend her before all of society, had watched him publicly reject Caroline and declare his intention to marry Eleanor if she would have him, and all her doubts and fears seemed suddenly insignificant in the face of such unequivocal declaration. Beatrice sat beside her, squeezing her hand so tightly it hurt, and whispering urgently, "Go to him, Eleanor, go now!" And Eleanor found herself standing without conscious decision, her body moving before her mind had fully processed what she was doing, and she stepped out of her family's box and made her way down to the ground floor where James waited. The crowd parted before her, creating a path, and she was aware of hundreds of eyes watching her progress, but for once she did not care what society thought or what gossip would circulate tomorrow. For all that mattered was reaching James and telling him what she should have trusted from the beginning, that she loved him and believed in him despite her fears. Eleanor stood in her family's box with her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone in the opera house must surely hear it. And then, with all of London society watching, she gathered her skirts and made her way down to the ground floor where James waited, each step feeling both terrifying and inevitable, like walking toward her destiny rather than simply crossing a theatre. The crowd was silent in a way that hundreds of people are rarely silent, breathless with anticipation as they witnessed what was clearly a pivotal moment in a love story they had been following for weeks. And Eleanor was aware of faces turning to watch her progress, but she kept her eyes fixed on James, standing at the center of the cleared space, tall and solid, and waiting for her with an expression that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. When she finally reached him, he took both her hands in his, and though he did not speak loudly enough for the entire opera house to hear, his voice carried to those in the nearest boxes and would be repeated and embellished in every drawing room by morning. "Eleanor," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like prayer and promise combined. "I must apologize for my coldness after Lady Pemberton's ball. I was hurt by your doubt, but I should have understood that Caroline's return would naturally resurrect old fears. I should have told you immediately and publicly that she lied when she claimed I had been calling upon her." He squeezed her hands gently, as though afraid she might pull away. "I have not seen Caroline privately. I have not spoken with her beyond basic civility at social functions. Everything she told you was fabrication designed to separate us, and I was a fool not to realize she would attempt such manipulation." Eleanor felt tears gathering in her eyes, but they were good tears now, joyful tears that washed away the pain and doubt of the past days, and she watched as James took a deep breath, as though preparing for the most important words of his life. "I love you, Eleanor," he declared, his voice growing stronger and more certain with each word. "I love you beyond measure, beyond reason, beyond anything I thought myself capable of feeling. You are brave enough to refuse a duke when he wronged you, brilliant enough to match me in any conversation, strong enough to give me a second chance when I deserved none, and you have made me better than I was, better than I thought I could be." Then before Eleanor could respond, before she could tell him that she loved him too, and that her fears had been foolish, and that she was sorry for doubting, James released her hands and lowered himself to one knee there on the floor of the King's Theatre, with hundreds of London's elite watching from the boxes above. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal an emerald ring that caught the gaslight and threw green fire, and Eleanor recognized it immediately as an heirloom, something precious and meaningful rather than merely expensive. "This was my mother's ring," James said, his voice carrying emotion that he made no attempt to hide. "She wore it for 40 years and told me before she died that I should give it to the woman who captured not just my attention but my heart. I have been waiting for that woman for years, Eleanor, and I found her in you." The opera house around them was so silent that Eleanor could hear her own breathing, could hear James's breath, could hear nothing but the two of them and the momentous question that hung in the air, waiting to be asked. "Eleanor Hartley," James said with his eyes locked on hers. "I know I wounded you terribly once in public before many of these same witnesses. Let me now declare before all these same people that I love you with everything I am and everything I hope to become. You are brave and brilliant, and you have made me better than I was. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that spilled over and ran down her cheeks, but she was smiling through them with joy so intense it felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and all her fear evaporated in the face of such public, undeniable declaration. She saw James's love plainly written in his face, in his eyes, in the way his hands trembled slightly as he held the ring, and she understood that he had chosen her not privately where it could be hidden or denied, but before all the people who had witnessed her humiliation at Almack's, creating symmetry that was perfect in its justice and its romance. "Yes," she said, and then louder so that more could hear, "Yes, James, yes, I will marry you. You sent me 21,000 roses. You wrote me a letter that laid bare your soul. You confronted your past publicly to defend me. You have proven yourself over and over in ways both grand and small. How could I possibly say anything but yes?" James surged to his feet and slipped the emerald ring onto her finger where it fit as though it had been made for her hand, and then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her before all of London society with passion that was barely proper but absolutely sincere, and the opera house erupted into applause that started in the nearest boxes and spread like wildfire until hundreds of people were clapping and cheering their approval. Someone called out from an upper box, "About time, Ashford," and the comment drew laughter that released the tension that had held the crowd in thrall. And suddenly everyone was talking at once, exclaiming over the romance of it all, declaring it the most extraordinary proposal they had ever witnessed, and Eleanor heard through the noise that she and James were already being called the love story of the season. James pulled back just enough to look into her face, his hands cupping her cheeks as though she were something precious he needed to hold carefully. "I love you," he whispered for her ears alone. "I will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of you." "And I love you," Eleanor replied, her voice thick with tears and joy. "I am sorry I doubted. Sorry I let fear blind me to what was right before my eyes." They stood together at the center of the opera house floor with applause raining down upon them from every box. And even the orchestra conductor had turned to watch with his baton forgotten in his hand. And Eleanor thought that this moment of public triumph was the perfect counterpoint to her public humiliation, that what had begun so terribly at Almack's had been transformed into something beautiful here at the King's Theatre, and she understood that sometimes the greatest love stories are those that overcome the worst beginnings. 6 weeks after the proposal at the King's Theatre that had scandalized and delighted London in equal measure, Eleanor Hartley prepared to become Eleanor Rothwell, Duchess of Ashford, in a ceremony that promised to be the social event of the season. The wedding was held at St. George's, Hanover Square, the same church district as Almack's assembly rooms, where their story had begun so inauspiciously, and the choice of location was deliberate on both their parts. A public statement that they were reclaiming the geography of Eleanor's humiliation and transforming it into the setting of their triumph. The church was filled not with traditional white flowers, but with roses in arrangements that told the story of their courtship. Crimson like the first delivery, white like the second, pink like the 15th day when Eleanor had finally kept them, and rainbow-colored like the 7th day when James had first varied his approach. And there were exactly 21 arrangements representing the 21 days he had proven himself through persistent devotion. Eleanor stood in the vestibule of the church wearing ivory silk that gleamed like moonlight and her mother's pearls at her throat, the same pearls her mother had worn at her own wedding 40 years prior, and she felt radiant in a way that had nothing to do with her gown or jewels, but everything to do with the certainty in her heart. Her father stood beside her offering his arm, and for once his expression carried genuine warmth rather than calculation, for even the Earl of Hartley had been moved by the extraordinary courtship that had led to this day. "You look beautiful, my dear," he said quietly as the organ began to play, "and I find myself thinking that perhaps things have worked out better than any of us could have planned." Eleanor smiled up at him. "They have, Papa," she agreed. "They truly have." The doors opened, and Eleanor began the walk down the aisle on her father's arm, and every eye in the packed church turned to watch her progress. But she had eyes only for James, who waited at the altar with an expression of such love and wonder that it made her breath catch. He was resplendent in formal attire, but it was not his clothing that held her attention. It was his eyes that never left her face, that drank in the sight of her as though she were water, and he a man dying of thirst. And Eleanor felt her own eyes filling with tears at the sheer joy of this moment. The church was filled with summer light streaming through stained glass windows that painted the congregation in jewel tones, and the 21 rose arrangements perfumed the air with fragrance that brought back memories of the past 6 weeks, of rejection and persistence, of doubt and trust, of fear transformed into love. Eleanor's friends and family beamed from the pews, Beatrice crying openly with happiness. Lady Hartley looking satisfied that her daughter had secured such an advantageous match, though Eleanor knew her mother still did not fully understand that this was about far more than title and fortune. Even Lord Bancroft, whom Eleanor had come to know and appreciate during the courtship, was wiping surreptitiously at his eyes, moved by a romance he had witnessed from its terrible beginning to this joyful culmination. London summer was at its finest, warm and golden with a quality of light that made everything seem touched by magic, and the day itself felt full of promise, of new beginnings, of hope fulfilled. When Eleanor reached the altar, her father placed her hand in James's with a formality that carried genuine blessing, and the moment their fingers touched, Eleanor felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was where she was meant to be. This was who she was meant to be with, and everything that had come before, all the pain and humiliation and fear, had been necessary to bring them to this perfect moment. The ceremony proceeded with traditional solemnity, but also with joy that was palpable, and when the time came to exchange vows, both Eleanor and James spoke with voices that trembled slightly, but carried clearly through the church, promising to love and honor and cherish not because convention demanded it, but because their hearts required it. Tears gathered in both their eyes as they made these promises, tears of joy at having found each other, tears of gratitude that they had been given a second chance after such a disastrous beginning, tears of relief that all the struggle and doubt had led to this moment of absolute certainty. The bishop pronounced them husband and wife with satisfaction evident in his voice, for he too had heard the story of their courtship and appreciated being part of such a romantic conclusion, and when he invited James to kiss his bride, the Duke needed no second invitation. He pulled Eleanor close and kissed her with tenderness that made the congregation sigh collectively, and the kiss was met with cheers and applause that echoed through the ancient church, society celebrating a love story that had captured their imagination and restored their faith in happy endings. As they processed back down the aisle as husband and wife, Eleanor felt as though she were floating, her hand tucked securely in James's arm, and she leaned close enough that only he could hear her whispered question. "No regrets?" she asked, giving him one final chance to acknowledge any doubt. James looked down at her with eyes that held nothing but love and certainty. "Only that I did not see you clearly from the beginning," he replied quietly, "that I wasted time in fear when I could have been loving you, but perhaps that too was necessary." Eleanor smiled, wise beyond her years with understanding earned through pain and patience. "Everything happened as it should," she said. "We would not be who we are without the journey. The joy is sweeter because we know what it cost to achieve it." James squeezed her hand gently. "Wise as well as beautiful," he observed with the teasing tone she had come to love during their courtship. "I am a fortunate man indeed." "And you are fortunate I am forgiving," Eleanor replied with matching lightness. "For without my capacity for forgiveness, you would still be sending roses, and I would still be refusing them." They emerged from the church into brilliant sunshine and were met with a shower of rose petals thrown by well-wishers, and as they climbed into the carriage that would carry them to the wedding breakfast, Eleanor looked back at St. George's and thought how different this departure was from her flight from Almack's just 2 months prior. How completely her life had transformed in such a short time, and she felt nothing but gratitude for every moment of the journey that had brought her here. 1 year after Eleanor and James exchanged vows at St. George's, Hanover Square, they hosted a ball at Ashford House that would be remembered as one of the season's most elegant affairs, though the true purpose of the gathering was known only to their closest friends until the formal announcement was made. As guests arrived at the Duke's magnificent London residence, They noticed rose petals scattered across the marble floors of the entrance hall, a gentle callback to the courtship that had captured London's imagination, and those who had followed the story from its scandalous beginning smiled at the romantic touch. Eleanor stood beside James in the receiving line, greeting their friends, and she was glowing in a way that had nothing to do with her gown of rose-colored silk, and everything to do with the happiness that radiated from within. The contentment of a woman who had found not just love, but partnership, not just marriage, but genuine communion of souls. James could not stop smiling as he stood beside his wife, his hand occasionally finding the small of her back in a touch that was both possessive and tender. And he had discovered over the past year that vulnerability was not weakness, but rather the foundation of true intimacy, that opening his heart to Eleanor had not made him weaker, but immeasurably stronger. The ballroom at Ashford House was magnificent and welcoming in equal measure, decorated with taste that reflected both Eleanor's influence and James's resources. And summer had returned in all its glory, the cycle of seasons complete, bringing them back to the time of year when their story had reached its climax at the King's Theatre. Chandeliers blazed overhead, casting golden light across guests dressed in their finest, and music swelled from the orchestra James had engaged for the evening, and the scent of roses was everywhere, filling the air with fragrance that had become synonymous with their love story. Outside the tall windows, London continued its evening routines, the great city never truly sleeping. But inside Ashford House there was warmth and light and love so palpable that even the most cynical guests felt touched by it. The atmosphere was celebratory and triumphant. Society gathered to honor a couple who had overcome scandal and doubt to build something genuine and lasting. And when James raised his hand for silence and announced that he and Eleanor were expecting their first child in the winter, the ballroom erupted in applause and congratulations that came from genuine affection rather than mere social obligation. Eleanor felt complete joy as she accepted the good wishes of their friends. Joy that came from being married to a man who adored her and whom she adored in return. Joy at the prospect of the child growing within her. Joy at the knowledge that their love had been built on foundations of honesty and tested by adversity, and had emerged stronger for both. She looked at James and saw in his face the same wonder she felt, the same gratitude that fate had brought them together despite the inauspicious beginning, and she understood that every difficulty they had faced had been necessary to forge the bond they now shared. When the orchestra began playing a waltz, James led Eleanor onto the floor for the first dance as host and hostess, and society watched with approval as the Duke and Duchess moved together with the grace of two people perfectly attuned to each other, lost in their own world even as hundreds observed. Who would have thought that day at Almack's would lead to this? Eleanor murmured as they turned across the polished floor, that public humiliation would transform into private joy, that roses sent in penance would become symbols of the greatest love I have ever known. James pulled her infinitesimally closer within the bounds of propriety. I am grateful for every rose, he replied quietly. For every rejection you gave me, because each one taught me that you were worth fighting for. Grateful for every moment that brought us here, even the painful ones, especially the painful ones. Eleanor looked up at him with eyes that still held the power to make his heart race. Even the painful ones? She asked, though she knew the answer already. Especially those, James confirmed, his voice carrying conviction. They taught me that true love requires courage, Eleanor. That vulnerability is not weakness, but strength. That you were worth every fear I had to face, every wall I had to tear down, every rose I had to send. Nearby a guest leaned toward her companion and commented in a voice pitched to carry, "The Duke and his Duchess, quite the love story, is it not? From scandal to romance, from humiliation to triumph. I do not think I have ever witnessed anything quite so extraordinary." The companion nodded enthusiastically. 21,000 roses, she breathed with the wonder of someone recounting a fairy tale. One can hardly imagine such devotion, such persistence. Surely it proves that true love can overcome any obstacle. As Eleanor and James continued their waltz, oblivious to the comments and content in their own happiness, the ball swirled around them in a celebration that was both ending and beginning, ending the story that had begun at Almack's more than a year ago and beginning the next chapter of their lives together. The rose petals on the floor were trodden by dancing feet until they released their fragrance more fully. And Eleanor thought how perfectly the symbol fit. Roses that had begun as penance had become promise. Flowers that marked days of refusal now celebrated days of acceptance, and beauty that had once represented pain now embodied only joy. When the dance ended, James led Eleanor from the floor to where Lord Bancroft stood with his wife, and the four of them formed a small island of intimacy amid the larger gathering. To the Duke and Duchess, Bancroft said, raising his champagne glass, "May their love story inspire us all to persist in the face of rejection, to believe in second chances, and to remember that the greatest romances often have the most unlikely beginnings." They drank to the toast, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears, grateful tears, tears that acknowledged how far they had come and how much they had overcome. The scandal that had begun at Almack's with a public rejection had indeed become a legendary love story, told and retold in drawing rooms across London and beyond, embellished with each retelling until the facts themselves became almost mythical. But Eleanor knew the truth beneath the myth, that love was not easy or simple, that it required courage and forgiveness and the willingness to be vulnerable, but that when it was real and honest and fought for, it was worth every difficulty, every tear, every rose sent and refused and finally accepted. The ball continued late into the night with dancing and conversation and celebration. And when the last guests finally departed, and Eleanor and James stood alone in their now quiet ballroom, they looked at each other and smiled with the shared understanding of people who have journeyed together through darkness into light. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, "for not giving up, for sending roses until I believed, for proving yourself worthy of my trust." "Thank you," James replied with equal tenderness, "for refusing until I understood what I was asking for demanding that I prove myself, for loving me despite everything." They walked hand in hand through the ballroom where rose petals still scattered the floor, and Eleanor knew that years from now, when their children asked how their parents met and fell in love, she would tell them the truth, that it began with rejection and humiliation at Almack's, continued with 21,000 roses, and culminated in a love that was worth every moment of pain it took to achieve. And she would tell them that sometimes the best stories are the ones that begin badly, because they teach us that real love is not found in perfect beginnings, but in the willingness to fight for imperfect middles until they transform into joyful endings. Dear listener, as the final notes of our story fade into the quiet of the night, perhaps you find yourself reflecting on Eleanor and James's extraordinary journey from public humiliation to private joy, from 21,000 roses refused to a lifetime of love accepted. Their story reminds us that our greatest wounds can become the foundation of our greatest strengths, that persistence in the face of rejection is not foolishness but courage, and that forgiveness is not weakness but the bravest choice we can make. How many of us have faced our own version of Almack's, those moments when we felt publicly diminished or privately betrayed, when hope seemed dangerous and walls seemed safer than vulnerability? Eleanor teaches us that strength is not found in refusing to feel pain, but in choosing not to let pain define us forever, that we can hold people accountable while still leaving space for growth and redemption. And James shows us that true change requires more than grand gestures. It demands sustained effort, honest self-examination, and the courage to lay bare our deepest fears. 21,000 roses could not buy Eleanor's forgiveness, but 21 days of consistent demonstration that he understood his error and was committed to becoming better, that earned her trust. As you prepare for sleep tonight, perhaps you carry your own hurts, your own walls built for protection that have become prisons, your own fears that vulnerability will lead only to more pain. Remember that Eleanor too carried these burdens, and yet she found the courage to hope again, to trust again, to love again. Your own story of healing and hope is still being written, and the chapters of pain need not be the final ones. Rest well knowing that persistence in love, whether love for another or love for yourself, is never wasted. May your dreams be gentle and your awakening filled with the courage to send your own roses or to finally accept the ones being offered. You are worthy of a love that persists, that proves itself, that transforms rejection into acceptance. Sleep now, dear listener, and wake tomorrow ready to write the next chapter of your own extraordinary love story. Thank you for journeying with us through the Duke and Eleanor's story. If this tale of roses and redemption touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and share this story with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late for second chances. Your support means everything to us and inspires us to continue bringing you stories of love, forgiveness, and transformation. At the end of this video, you'll find another unforgettable story waiting for you. Click it and discover your next emotional journey. With gratitude and warmest wishes for your own happy ending, Legends of the Fall.